Welcome back, hey my dear friends. Long before stone pyramids cast their shadows across the sands of Egypt, before marble columns rose in the hills of Greece, and before Roman roads stitched together an empire, a quieter but equally momentous story had already begun. It unfolded in a landscape of mud and reeds, of floods and droughts, of shimmering horizons, where two great rivers carved their way across the earth. This land was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. It's always a comfort to see how many corners of the world come together in these quiet evenings. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The name itself comes from the ancient Greeks, who, centuries later, looked back at this place with awe. Mesos for middle, Potamos for river, the middle land of the rivers. But for those who first settled here, it was not a name or a definition. It was survival. It was opportunity. And in time, it would become destiny. The Tigris and the Euphrates begin their lives far to the north, in the snowy ridges and craggy mountains of eastern Anatolia, what we now call Turkey. Fed by glaciers and rains, they tumble downward, carving valleys, splitting into tributaries, and finally spreading into wide floodplains as they descend south toward the Persian Gulf. Between them lay a vast alluvial plain, a land both unforgiving and generous, where nature could destroy in a single flood or sustain with life-giving fertility. It was in this precarious zone that humanity first dared to experiment with something radically new, staying put. The climate shifts of the 10th millennium BCE. To understand why this happened here, we must step back even further, to the great climatic shifts at the end of the last ice age. For over 2 million years, human life had been shaped by cycles of glaciation. The Pleistocene world was cold, unstable, and often harsh. Enormous sheets of ice stretched across northern Europe and Asia, trapping water, lowering sea levels, and forcing humans to adapt to constant change. Around 10,000 BCE, as the Ice Age loosened its grip, the world warmed. Glaciers melted, seas rose, forests spread, and rainfall patterns shifted. In the hills and valleys of Southwest Asia, new ecosystems appeared. Wild grasses, wheat, and barley grew in abundance. Pistachio trees dropped their nuts in groves. Herds of gazelle grazed the hillsides. For nomadic hunter-gatherers, this was a gift, but it was also a temptation. Why keep moving when the land itself now offered so much? For tens of thousands of years, humans had survived by moving with the seasons, following herds of animals, gathering berries and roots, adapting to the rhythms of the wild. Mobility was safety. Movement was life. Yet slowly, in this new, warmer world, some bands of people began to linger. The first experiments in permanence. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this extraordinary turning point. In northern Syria, at Abu Huraira, people built circular huts of mud and reeds around 9,500 BCE. They hunted gazelle and gathered wild grains. But unlike their ancestors, they returned to the same site year after year. Beneath the floors of these huts, archaeologists found the bones of gazelle, charred seeds of barley and rye, and grinding stones worn smooth from hours of crushing grain. Nearby at Murebit along the Euphrates, the same story unfolded. Families began to anchor themselves to place. Their homes were no longer the temporary lean-tos of nomads, but sturdier structures with hearths for cooking and storage pits for food. But the greatest leap came farther south in the Jordan Valley, at Jericho. Around 9000 BCE, Jericho was not just a camp, but a true settlement. Here, people built stone walls, massive constructions for such an early time. What drove them? Defense from other groups? Protection against floods? Perhaps both. But the message was clear. This was no place to abandon lightly. Here, people intended to stay. Most remarkable of all, the people of Jericho built a tower rising nearly 9 meters, with an interior staircase spiraling upward. It stands as one of the world's earliest monuments. Its purpose remains debated. Some suggest it aligned with the setting sun at the summer solstice, an early act of astronomical observation. Others see it as a communal watchtower, a declaration of presence and permanence. Whatever its purpose, it represented a profound shift. Humanity was no longer only surviving, but beginning to symbolize, to build structures that declared identity and continuity. Çatalhöyük, a city without streets. In Anatolia, around 7,500 BCE, another settlement emerged that would astonish future archaeologists. Çatalhöyük. This was no mere village of huts, but a proto-city, home to perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 people. Yet unlike later cities, Çatalhöyük had no streets. Houses pressed tightly against one another, accessed through doors in the roof. People moved across the settlement like ants across a hive, clambering from rooftop to rooftop, descending into their homes by ladder. Inside, they painted walls with vivid images, bulls with massive horns, hunting scenes, and perhaps symbolic figures of women. In some homes, the dead were buried beneath the floors, their bodies curled in sleep-like positions, their presence woven into the fabric of daily life. Life here was dense, communal, and experimental. But even Çatalhöyük was not the true beginning of civilization. It was the fields outside the homes that carried the revolution, the agricultural revolution. For countless generations, humans had gathered wild grains, but gradually they began to notice differences. Some stalks grew taller, some seeds were larger, some husks held firm instead of scattering in the wind. Through the slow process of selection, gathering, and replanting the most useful grains, humans unknowingly guided the evolution of plants. By around 8,000 BCE, wheat and barley were no longer wild. They had become domesticated crops, reliant on humans for planting, harvesting, and propagation. With these grains came a new rhythm of life, sowing in spring, tending through summer, harvesting in autumn, storing through winter. The seasons, once guides for migration, became the cycle of permanence. Animals followed the same path. The fierce aurochs, massive long-horned ancestors of cattle, were gradually tamed. Sheep and goats, once darting wild across rocky hills, became herds in pens. Pigs, opportunistic scavengers, rooted through human waste and quickly adapted to life alongside people. The implications were staggering. For the first time in history, food could be produced in predictable quantities. Hunger no longer stalked every day. With domestication came milk, hides, wool, and meat on demand. The uncertainty of the hunt gave way to the reliability of the herd, the surplus, and its consequences. This agricultural revolution brought something humanity had never known before: surplus. Fields produced more than a family could consume. Grains could be stored in pits or jars, feeding people through lean seasons. And with surplus came time for some to step away from constant food gathering and experiment in other skills. Potters, weavers, flint knappers, and eventually metal workers emerged. A new concept appeared: specialization. But surplus was also a double-edged sword. What can be stored can also be stolen. Stored grain required protection, walls, guards, cooperation. Villages needed not only farmers and craftsmen, but organizers, leaders, and defenders. Jericho's walls, Çatalhöyük's compact housing, the gradual clustering of families into defended communities, all were answers to the new challenges of permanence. Pottery, the silent revolution around 6,000 BCE. Another quiet revolution transformed daily life. Pottery. Before clay was fired, food storage depended on baskets, leather skins, or stone bowls. But these were limited, fragile, and perishable. Fired clay, however, produced containers that were lightweight, durable, and waterproof. For the first time, grain could be stored securely against pests, and moisture. Liquids could be carried across distances. Meals could be cooked more efficiently. It is difficult for us, surrounded by plastic and metal, to appreciate how revolutionary pottery was. But in the Neolithic world, clay jars were the technology of stability. They allowed settlements to grow larger, safer, and more complex. Harnessing the rivers. The true transformation came when people turned their gaze toward the rivers themselves. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable. Sometimes they flooded too much, destroying crops. Other times they failed, leaving fields dry. But in their silt-rich waters lay potential. By digging canals, building dikes, and guiding the floods, people learned to harness the rivers. Irrigation turned dry plains into fertile fields. It allowed agriculture to expand beyond the narrow riverbanks, sustaining larger populations. But it also demanded cooperation. No single family could build or maintain an irrigation system alone. Entire communities had to work together, to plan, to coordinate, to enforce fairness. This was the seed of organized society. For when humans dug canals, they also dug the first foundations of government, the first settlements of the south. By 5000 BCE, in the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, where the rivers fanned into marshes and plains, settlements began to cluster and grow. Eridu, Uruk, names that would later become legends, began as modest farming villages. Their homes of mud brick clustered around water channels. Life here was still simple, still fragile, yet the potential was immense. Eridu, according to later Mesopotamian tradition, was the first city founded by the gods themselves. Archaeology shows that by 4800 BCE, Eridu had indeed developed into a significant settlement, with a small temple dedicated to the water god Enki. This was more than a place to live. It was a place to worship, to gather, to organize. Uruk, still in its infancy, would one day become the largest city in the world. But in these early centuries, it was only a seed. Farmers worked the canals, shepherds herded flocks, potters shaped clay, and priests, or perhaps elders wise in ritual, began to play roles in guiding the community. The dawn of civilization. Looking back now, we can see that the foundations of civilization were already being laid. Permanent settlements, agriculture, surplus, specialization, pottery, irrigation, temples, organization. None of these were sudden discoveries. Each unfolded slowly, across centuries. But together, they wove a tapestry that was unlike anything humanity had ever known. And though the people of those early villages could not have known it, they were standing at the threshold of something vast. Cities, kingdoms, empires, writing, law, literature, and legend. It began in mud huts along the rivers. It began with seeds, saved from one season to the next. It began with animals, tethered instead of hunted. It began with walls of stone and towers that touched the sun. The land between the rivers was not easy. It was a place of danger, flood, and uncertainty. But it was also a land of possibility, where the first sparks of civilization glowed. In the centuries to come, those sparks would ignite into flame. From Eridu and Uruk would rise temples that scraped the sky. From humble clay tokens would emerge writing itself. And from the fragile balance between survival and abundance would come the first experiments in kingship, in justice, in organized society. This was Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the first chapter in humanity's long unfinished story. From nomads to settlers, for hundreds of thousands of years, humanity's story was one of constant movement. Families and bands traveled in search of food, following the migrations of animals, the ripening of fruits, the patterns of the seasons. A home was nothing more than a temporary shelter of hide or wood, soon abandoned when the earth around it could no longer give enough. Safety lay in mobility, and identity was tied not to a place but to the journey itself. Yet as the Ice Age melted away and warmth spread across the valleys of the Near East, that ancient rhythm began to falter. The climate was changing, the land itself was shifting, and suddenly, nature seemed to invite humanity to do something it had never done before, to stop. The rivers of the Fertile Crescent, swollen by glacial melt and seasonal rains, carried silt and fertility down into lowland valleys. Along their banks, wild stands of wheat and barley grew thick, as though planted by unseen hands. Groves of pistachio trees dropped their nuts in abundance. Gazelle herds clustered in numbers too great to exhaust. For a people accustomed to scarcity, it was a vision of plenty. To remain in one place was no longer a gamble against hunger. It was an opportunity, and so some bands of hunter-gatherers dared to linger. At first, they stayed for a season, returning year after year to the same fertile spots. Over generations, those temporary encampments hardened into something more enduring. The world was entering a new experiment in living. Archaeologists have found traces of these first experiments at places like Abu Huraira, along the Euphrates. Here, in huts of mud and reeds, families ground wild rye on heavy stone mortars. The sheer quantity of grain fragments preserved in the soil suggests deliberate harvesting, not chance gathering. What had once been the work of foraging became the beginnings of farming. Though the people themselves would not have thought of it that way, they were simply responding to the abundance before them, learning that seeds cast into the soil would rise again, that the earth could be coaxed into repeating its gifts. But it was not only grain that tied people to place. Herd animals once hunted began to be tamed. Sheep and goats, naturally social and hardy, were kept near settlements. The pig, drawn by scraps and waste, adapted easily to life alongside humans. Even the fierce aurochs, ancestors of cattle, were slowly brought under human control. Each generation found it easier to keep animals close than to chase them endlessly across the far hills. The campfire became a corral, the wild herd a flock. For the first time, meat, milk, wool, and hides were resources that could be planned, measured, and secured. Nowhere is this shift more dramatically visible than in Jericho, often called the world's first town. Around 9000 BCE, its people built more than houses. They built walls. Stone fortifications rose around their homes, massive for their age, a collective effort requiring planning and cooperation. These walls were not simply practical defenses against enemies or floods. They were symbolic declarations. They said, "We live here. This place is ours." Within the walls, the community built a tower, its spiral staircase winding upward into the light. Rising nearly 9 meters, it stood as a monument unlike anything else in the world at the time. Whether a watchtower, a ritual center, or an early calendar aligned to the sun, its purpose is debated, but its presence is undeniable. Humanity was no longer building only for shelter, but for permanence, for meaning, for identity tied to a single spot of earth. Farther north in Anatolia, another remarkable settlement took form, Çatalhöyük. Here, thousands of people lived in houses pressed so tightly together that there were no streets. The rooftops formed a network of paths, and ladders served as doorways into each home. Daily life unfolded in close quarters. Inside the houses, walls were decorated with bold images, charging bulls, hunting scenes, mysterious symbols, and beneath the floors, the dead were buried. The ancestors rested directly under the spaces where the living slept, cooked, and shared meals. The village was not just a collection of the living, but a tapestry of past and present, woven together, each generation literally building upon the bones of the last. The decision to settle reshaped not just landscapes, but bodies and minds. The bones of early farmers show the toll of this new life. Compared to their roaming ancestors, they were shorter, their teeth more prone to decay from diets rich in starchy grains. Disease spread more easily in crowded settlements, and living alongside animals introduced new illnesses to human communities. Yet despite these hardships, farming communities grew. What they lost in individual health, they gained in sheer numbers. Food surpluses allowed more children to survive, and population swelled. Villages expanded, fields spread outward, and the cycle deepened. Humanity was binding itself to the soil, even at a cost. The surplus itself was both blessing and burden. Grain harvested in abundance could feed a village through lean seasons, but it also had to be stored. Storage demanded containers, leading to the invention of pottery, one of the quiet revolutions of human history. Clay, once shaped and fired, became durable jars that could hold grain safely against pests, and moisture, or transport water across distances. Food could be preserved in ways impossible before, and diets expanded through cooking. Painted designs on pots gave expression to identity and culture. As vessels became more than tools, they became symbols of belonging. But stored wealth also created new problems. A sack of barley was no longer just food. It was power. For the first time, inequality emerged within communities. Some families accumulated more, others less. Some controlled herds, others depended on neighbors. The egalitarian spirit of hunter-gatherer life gave way to hierarchy, to disputes over ownership, to the beginnings of authority. Leadership was needed to organize irrigation, to resolve conflicts, to defend against raiders who saw in a grain storehouse a prize worth seizing. The seeds of politics and social order sprouted from the fields as surely as the wheat itself. Ritual grew alongside these changes. Farming was uncertain, always at the mercy of weather, pests, and rivers. Communities turned to unseen powers for protection. Small shrines became gathering places, where elders or spiritual leaders performed rituals for fertility, rain, and harvest. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, people raised vast stone pillars carved with animals and symbols long before cities arose. Though its builders were still semi-nomadic, it shows the scale of cooperation ritual could inspire. As people settled, these sacred traditions became central, giving meaning to the new life of permanence and binding communities together with shared belief. The Tigris and Euphrates posed their own challenges. Their floods were unpredictable, sometimes destructive, sometimes absent. To thrive in southern Mesopotamia required ingenuity. Communities dug canals, built dikes, and guided the waters into fields. Irrigation expanded the range of farmland and allowed for larger populations, but it demanded cooperation on a new scale. No single family could manage an irrigation network. It required planning, labor, and rules. In this way, the rivers did more than water crops. They trained humans in the art of society. To control water was to take the first step toward organized government. By 5000 BCE, small settlements began to cluster in the southern plains. Among them were Eridu and Uruk, names that would echo across millennia. Eridu, by later tradition, was the first city founded by the gods themselves. Archaeology shows layer upon layer of rebuilding, with a shrine to the water god Enki at its core. Each generation added to the sacred space, reaffirming the connection between community, land, and divinity. Uruk, at first no more than a cluster of homes near irrigation channels, would grow into the largest city of the ancient world. Even in its earliest centuries, its people were shaping clay, trading goods, and establishing patterns of life that would set the stage for urban civilization. Yet permanence carried a cost. Diseases flourished in dense villages. Labor bent bodies and shortened lives. War, once small-scale, grew sharper as grain stores and herds became prizes worth raiding. The risks were real, but the benefits outweighed them. A family tied to fields had more food than a family following herds. A child raised in a village had more chance of survival than one born on the move. Communities became larger, more secure, and more enduring. With each passing century, the experiment of settlement grew harder to undo. By the end of this long Neolithic transition, humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The nomadic band had become the permanent village. The camp had become the town, and soon the town would give birth to the city. Surpluses, pottery, irrigation, shrines, inequality, leadership, all these developments, together, created the conditions for something unprecedented: civilization itself. The ancient rhythm of movement still echoed in the stories and memories of these people, but their futures were now planted in the ground. Fields and flocks bound them to place. Walls and towers marked their permanence, and rituals bound their communities together. The human story had changed course forever, and the world between the rivers was leading the way. The birth of agriculture and irrigation. If the decision to settle was the first great leap, then the mastery of farming was the second. Humanity's story had always been dictated by the chase, to gather what the wild offered before it vanished, to hunt before prey escaped, to consume before the season ended. Yet in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, people discovered that the earth could be persuaded to give not once, but again and again, if only one learned how to bend it to human will. In this revelation, the true birth of agriculture began, and with it, civilization stepped firmly onto the stage of history. For thousands of years, people had observed the wild grains that grew along riverbanks and in fertile plains. Wheat and barley swayed in the breeze, fragile and fleeting, yet nourishing enough to sustain those who gathered them. To pluck them was easy. To grind them into flour with heavy stones was harder. To live from them year after year required something far greater: patience, observation, and choice. Over generations, people began to notice differences among the stalks. Some stood taller and resisted wind. Some held their seeds more tightly instead of scattering them uselessly on the breeze. Some ripened more predictably. These became the ones chosen, replanted, guarded. It was not a single invention, not a spark of sudden genius, but a slow refinement that turned wild grasses into domesticated crops. The shift was monumental. No longer did people wait upon the mercy of nature. They began to direct it. Planting meant planning. Sowing meant imagining a future season, trusting that the earth would yield. The very concept of time changed. Life was no longer a cycle of wandering, but a rhythm of seasons. Sow in spring, tend through summer, reap in autumn, store for winter. For the first time, human survival depended not on the next hunt or the next grove of berries, but time what one had sown months before. The people themselves changed, reshaped by patience and foresight, bound to the land they cultivated. Animals followed a similar path. Sheep and goats, once darting across rocky hillsides, became companions in pens. Over generations they grew smaller, more docile, more attuned to human needs. Their milk flowed daily. Their wool could be shorn and spun. Their meat was available without the dangers of the hunt. Pigs rooted through garbage, fattening themselves on scraps, thriving in the shadow of human settlements. Even the aurochs, those massive, dangerous beasts of the plains, slowly bent to domestication, their descendants forming the first cattle herds. Humanity was no longer just a predator in nature's cycle, but a keeper of life, a guardian, and at times, a tyrant over plants and animals alike. Yet abundance carried burdens. Grain did not last long without protection. A single season of rain could rot a storehouse. A swarm of pests could reduce months of labor to nothing. Storage demanded ingenuity. At first, pits were dug in the earth, sealed with clay and stone. Then came baskets woven from reeds, smeared with bitumen, to hold grain against damp. Finally, pottery appeared, a technology that would transform daily existence. With clay jars sealed and strong, surplus could be stored for months, even years. Food could now outlast the season, outlast even the farmer who harvested it. Pottery meant continuity, the ability to plan for lean times, to support larger families, to trade. The humblest clay pot, resting silent in the corner of a home, represented security, wealth, and survival. But stored food also drew eyes. For the first time, theft and conflict took on new meaning. A stolen sack of grain was not a single lost meal, but the destruction of an entire family's as survival through the winter. With surplus came the need for protection, for walls and guards, for rules and punishments. Villages that had once been simple clusters of huts became defended communities, and leaders emerged to organize, to judge, to command. Surplus was not just food. It was the seed of politics, hierarchy, and law. The rivers of Mesopotamia gave generously, but they demanded tribute in return. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, sometimes too much, sometimes too little. Fields could be washed away one year, parched the next. To truly master agriculture here required more than planting and harvesting. It required bending the rivers themselves. People dug canals to channel floodwaters into fields, cut dikes to control their force, and built levees to protect their homes. They turned rivers into tools, reshaping the land with their hands. Irrigation was not just an innovation, it was a revolution. With it, fields could be watered beyond the narrow banks of the rivers, transforming deserts into farmland. Populations grew, settlements expanded, and the scale of cooperation deepened. Irrigation demanded organization. Canals had to be dug, maintained, cleared of silt, and defended from collapse. Water had to be distributed fairly. Too much for one field meant drought for another. The entire village had to labor together, each family contributing. No single household could manage an irrigation system alone. Here, in the muddy channels carved into Mesopotamia's soil, the first hints of bureaucracy were born. Meetings, rules, overseers, punishments. Society itself was reshaped by the flow of water. In learning to manage the rivers, humans learned to manage each other. The daily life of these early farmers was a mixture of toil and transformation. Men and women worked side by side, clearing fields, planting seeds, harvesting grain under the sun. Children learned to carry water, to tend goats, to shape clay. The cycle of the year dictated all things. Planting festivals in spring, harvest rituals in autumn, offerings to unseen powers to protect the crops. Religion grew from the soil as surely as the wheat. If rains failed, if floods destroyed, the gods must be appeased. Shrines appeared in villages, where offerings were laid before figures of fertility and water. Priests, or perhaps simply respected elders, performed rituals to ensure survival. Over time, these rituals became traditions, and traditions became institutions. The first temples rose not only as places of worship, but as centers of storage and redistribution, where grain was gathered and released in times of need, binding community and sacred power together. With agriculture came trade. Surplus grain could be exchanged for obsidian blades from Anatolia, for shells from the Persian Gulf, for lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan. Networks began to form, roads of barter that stitched together far-flung regions. Farmers produced, craftsmen shaped, traders carried. Each role depended on the others, weaving together the first threads of economic complexity. Villages no longer lived in isolation. They were tied into a growing web of exchange, knowledge, and contact. The human body bore witness to this transformation. Archaeologists studying skeletons from early farming communities see the marks of endless labor, bent spines from carrying water, worn knees from hours of grinding grain, teeth ground flat from stone particles, mixed into flour. Life was harder in many ways than in the days of hunting and gathering, when diet had been more varied and work less repetitive. Yet farmers endured, for they had security their ancestors had never known. A bad hunt once meant starvation. Now, a poor harvest could be balanced with stored grain or the generosity of neighbors. Survival was no longer left solely to chance. Inequality grew more visible with each passing century. Families with larger fields, bigger herds, or more storage jars held more power. Leaders emerged, at first perhaps chosen by consensus, later by inheritance or strength. Villages divided themselves into households of greater or lesser wealth. The seeds of kingship, of hierarchy, of statehood itself, were already present in the furrows of Mesopotamian soil. And with this came new conflicts, not just with the natural world, but with each other. Neighboring villages quarreled over land and water. Raids sought to seize grain and animals. War, once a matter of survival in the hunt, became a matter of wealth and expansion. And yet, even as conflict simmered, culture blossomed. Pottery evolved into art, decorated with intricate designs. Carvings appeared on stone, depicting animals, people, and symbols. Music, too, found its place. Simple flutes and drums accompanied rituals and gatherings. For the first time, humans were producing not just to live, but to express, to beautify, to leave behind a trace of themselves. The surplus that freed hands from constant foraging also freed minds to imagine. By the 4th millennium BCE, the settlements of southern Mesopotamia had grown into centers that were no longer villages, but proto-cities. At Eridu, layers of shrines rose one upon another, each new generation building larger and grander than the last. At Uruk, houses spread outward in clusters, pottery workshops multiplied, and canals cut deeper into the plains. Temples dominated the landscape, their mud-brick walls looming above homes, serving as both spiritual and administrative hearts of the community. Grain was gathered there, redistributed in times of need, and offered in ritual to the gods. In these temples, one can already glimpse the outlines of later city-states, with their priest-kings, their storehouses, and their authority over the people. The birth of agriculture and irrigation did more than change the way humans lived. It changed the way they thought. Time was no longer an endless cycle of movement, but a measured rhythm of seasons. Nature was no longer an untouchable force, but something that could be managed, harnessed, even commanded. The gods themselves, once distant and wild, became guardians of fields and rivers, intimately tied to the success or failure of the harvest. Humanity was no longer simply surviving within nature's order. It was reshaping that order in its own image. This was the true revolution of the Neolithic. The hunter had become the farmer. The gatherer had become the sower. The wanderer had become the settler. And in the muddy fields of Mesopotamia, civilization was quietly, inexorably being born. Rise of the first temples and priests. When fields began to yield more than was immediately needed, when surplus filled pots and storehouses, and when floods and droughts could either nourish or destroy with terrifying swiftness, human beings turned their eyes upward. In the stillness of the Mesopotamian night, under a vault of stars glittering like 1,000 watchful eyes, they began to ask questions larger than survival. Why did the river swell one year and fail the next? Why did storms sweep across the plains without warning? Why did life flourish in one season only to be struck down by plague in another? In those questions lay the seeds of religion, and from those seeds grew the first temples, the first priests, and the first organized worship of gods who would rule human destiny as surely as kings one day would. At first, the sacred was simple. A small shrine stood in the corner of the village, perhaps no larger than a hut. A carved figurine of clay or stone represented a spirit of fertility, a protector of water, or a god of the harvest. Families brought offerings, bowls of grain, a handful of dates, a lamb. The shrine was a place of hope, a place where uncertainty could be given shape, where fear could be soothed by ritual. Yet as settlements grew, as surplus deepened, as canals cut into the earth demanded cooperation and order, the shrines grew too. A single hut became a hall became a complex. The temple was born. The earliest temples were not separate from daily life, but woven into it. Their walls were raised from the same mud brick as houses, but they stood taller, painted white to gleam in the sun, their corners aligned with the cardinal points of the heavens. Inside, a chamber housed the god's image, cloaked in cloth, adorned with beads, and tended with food and drink, as though it were a living presence. For to the people of Mesopotamia, it was. The god did not merely reside in heaven. The god dwelt there in the temple among them. When floods threatened, it was because the god was angry. When crops flourished, it was because the god was pleased. The temple was no longer just a shrine. It was the axis around which life turned. As temples expanded, so too did the role of those who served within them. At first, they may have been elders, wise in ritual, experienced in planting, who led prayers for rain and fertility. But soon they became specialists, Men and women who devoted their lives to the mysteries of the gods. These were the first priests. Their duty was not only to perform rites, but to interpret the will of the divine. Was the flood a blessing or a curse? Did the stars foretell abundance or disaster? Was the sickness afflicting the herds a punishment or a warning? Comfort, order, and power. The temple became more than a place of worship. It became a storehouse. Grain collected from fields was brought to its courtyards, recorded and guarded. In times of famine, the temple distributed food. In times of surplus, it organized feasts. Those who controlled the temple thus controlled not only the gods, but the means of survival. Authority shifted. Where once the family head or village elder held sway, now the priesthood began to rise, cloaked in ritual, sanctified by belief. The gods had chosen their intermediaries, and through them society itself began to stratify. Archaeological remains at Eridu, one of the oldest cities of Sumer, reveal this evolution clearly. There, over centuries, temples rose layer upon layer, each new generation building atop the ruins of the last. What began as a modest hut became by 3000 BCE a massive complex of courtyards, altars, and chambers decorated with offerings and sacred symbols. At Uruk, the White Temple rose high above the plains, on an artificial platform, its gleaming walls visible for miles. Such elevation was no accident. By lifting the temple above the city, people declared it closer to the heavens, the true dwelling of the divine. Later, these platforms would grow into ziggurats, those colossal stair-step towers that still haunt the Mesopotamian imagination. Inside these early temples, daily life was consumed by ritual. At dawn, priests bathed and clothed the gods. Statue, as though the divine required care as a mortal king might. Meals were set before the god 3 times a day: bread, beer, meat, and sweets. Musicians played, singers chanted hymns, incense burned, and offerings of wine or oil perfumed the air. The god's presence was treated as tangible, requiring the full service of attendants. The divine was not distant but immediate, living, hungry, thirsty, demanding. To neglect the god was to risk catastrophe, for the god's mood could shape the fate of all. But the temple did more than mediate between humans and the divine. It also mediated between humans themselves. The collection and distribution of food required records. At first, simple clay tokens represented amounts of grain or livestock, but soon, symbols pressed into clay tablets recorded who gave what, who owed what, and who received what. Here, in the quiet corners of temple storehouses, writing itself was born. The cuneiform script, at first little more than pictographs of sheep or jars, soon became a language of trade, law, myth, and literature. The temple, in its hunger for order, gave humanity its most revolutionary tool, the written word. Temples also became centers of labor. Artisans crafted jewelry for rituals. Weavers spun cloth for offerings. Potters shaped vessels for sacred meals. Shepherds tended flocks belonging to the god. Farmers worked temple lands, and merchants carried temple goods to distant markets. The temple was not only a place of worship, but an economy, employing thousands, regulating trade, and overseeing the flow of wealth. To serve the temple was to serve the city. To defy it was to defy the gods themselves. The rise of the priesthood did not erase older forms of leadership, but intertwined with them. In times of war, military leaders arose, chosen to defend the canals and fields. Yet when the fighting ended, it was often the priest who interpreted whether victory was granted by divine favor. Gradually, some leaders held both roles. The priest-king emerged, ruling by divine sanction. His authority absolute, because it was said to come not from men but from the gods. These early kings wore not only crowns but sacred garments, their decrees both law and prophecy. Religious imagination flourished in these centuries. Myths were told of gods who formed humans from clay, to serve as their workers, who controlled wind and storm, who rose each morning with the sun and descended each evening into darkness. The goddess Inanna embodied love and war, fertility and chaos. Enki, god of water and wisdom, guided irrigation and invention. Enlil, lord of wind, carried storms across the plains. Each city elevated its patron deity, claiming divine favor above others. The gods mirrored human society, quarreling, loving, punishing, rewarding. They were immense, yet familiar, distant, yet intimately present. The dead, too, entered this growing religious order. In earlier times, burial may have been simple, a body laid in the earth, perhaps with a tool or ornament. But with the rise of temples came the belief in an underworld, a shadowy realm beneath the earth, where souls lingered. Offerings were made to ancestors, food and drink left to sustain them. The continuity of the family extended beyond death, binding generations together under the watch of the gods. Priests presided not only over harvests and feasts, but over funerals and memorials, linking the living and the dead in sacred ritual. The power of the temples shaped even architecture and art. Reliefs carved on stone depicted processions of worshippers bringing offerings, lines of cattle, baskets of grain, jars of wine. Statues of worshippers with wide staring eyes knelt before the gods eternally, their hands clasped, their gaze unbroken. Music too grew in sophistication, with lyres, harps, and drums accompanying hymns that echoed in temple halls. Art and music became servants of the divine. Yet in their beauty, they also revealed humanity's longing for meaning, for order, for transcendence. The rise of temples also carried tensions. As priests accumulated wealth and authority, as temples owned more land, more herds, and more workers, divisions deepened within society. The farmer toiled, but the priest consumed. The artisan labored, but the temple claimed his product. To many this was natural, for without the gods, the harvest might fail. But others, perhaps silently, may have wondered at the growing gulf between those who prayed and those who sweated. Hierarchy hardened. The temple's shadow lengthened over every field, every hearth, every life. Yet for all its power, the temple remained fragile. Floods could sweep it away. Fire could consume its wooden beams. Rival cities could plunder its treasures. Priests, for all their authority, still depended on the belief of the people, on the continued sense that the god dwelled within the walls. And so the temple had to continually prove itself through ritual, through generosity, through spectacle. Festivals grew grander. Statues were paraded through the streets, clothed in gold, borne on litters, accompanied by musicians and dancers. The entire city became a stage with the gods at its center, reminding all that their prosperity came from above. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, the temples of Mesopotamia had transformed from simple shrines into institutions that dominated life. They were the banks, the granaries, the courts, the schools, the theaters, the centers of art and law and economy. Through them, the first bureaucracies emerged. Through them, the first written records were made. Through them, the first great myths were told and retold, echoing into future ages. The temple was no longer merely a house of the gods. It was the house of civilization itself. From these sacred walls, the trajectory of human history bent forever. The farmers who had once bowed only to the rhythms of rain and soil now bowed also to priests and file, kings, to gods, who demanded loyalty not just of the body, but of the soul. And in that submission, in that faith, humanity gained something new, a shared order, a vision greater than any single family, a belief that their lives were part of a cosmic drama watched over by divine eyes. The temple, rising high above the mud-brick homes, gleaming in the sun, became the axis between heaven and earth. And within its walls, humanity's future of power, of faith, of empire began to take form. The age of Uruk and the birth of the city, the story of humanity's first true cities, begins on the windswept plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the rivers fanned into marshlands and the soil was rich with silt. Here a place emerged that would set the pattern for every metropolis to follow. That place was Uruk. It was not only a settlement of homes and workshops, but a force that reshaped human organization, a crucible where the inventions of writing, monumental architecture, bureaucracy, and kingship fused into the essence of civilization. By 3500 BCE, the shift from village to city was underway. Fields had grown broader, canals stretched farther, and populations swelled beyond what any single cluster of huts could contain. Communities that once numbered in the hundreds now counted thousands. Houses were packed side by side, their walls pressed against each other like bricks in a kiln. Narrow alleys twisted through neighborhoods, punctuated by open courtyards, where families cooked, crafted, and gathered. At the center of it all rose the temple, taller and more commanding with each generation, its platform expanding, its walls glistening in the sun. Uruk was not the first settlement, but it became the first true city. Archaeologists who have dug through its layers have uncovered an urban expanse covering nearly 250 hectares at its peak, a sprawl of houses, workshops, marketplaces, temples, and administrative buildings that may have housed more than 50,000 people. To grasp this scale is to understand the leap humanity had made. For countless generations, human groups had lived in bands of dozens, tribes of hundreds, villages of perhaps a few thousand. Uruk shattered those limits. Tens of thousands lived, worked, prayed, and traded together, bound not by kinship alone, but by shared systems of governance, economy, and belief. The White Temple, one of Uruk's crowning structures, stood high on its platform, visible for miles across the flat plain. Its whitewashed walls reflected the unrelenting sun, a beacon of divine presence and civic identity. From its heights, priests surveyed the city below, where life pulsed in an intricate dance of labor and ritual. At its base stretched broad plazas, where processions of worshippers carried offerings, where markets bustled, and where announcements of rulers echoed. The temple was not only the dwelling of gods, but the symbolic heart of the city. Its height proclaimed that human ambition could raise mountains where none existed, that mud and sweat could lift humanity closer to the heavens. Uruk's power lay not only in stone and brick, but in organization. Surplus grain flowed into temple storehouses, where it was counted, recorded, and redistributed. Livestock was tallied, wool was collected, beer was brewed in massive quantities, and textiles were woven in vast temple workshops employing hundreds of women. This system demanded records, and records demanded symbols. Out of this necessity, writing evolved. What began as clay tokens representing sacks of grain or flocks of sheep became marks pressed into clay tablets. A picture of a jar indicated oil. A mark of a head stood for a sheep. Over time, the symbols became more abstract, less pictures than signs, each capable of representing not just things but sounds. The leap was transformative. Writing was no longer just a tool of inventory. It became a language that could capture contracts, hymns, myths, and laws. In the tablet houses of Uruk, scribes labored with styluses of reed, pressing wedge-shaped impressions into wet clay, crafting the world's first cuneiform script. Their work preserved not only numbers but stories, ensuring that memory could survive beyond the fragile human voice. The emergence of writing changed power itself. Literacy was not common, but concentrated in the hands of scribes tied to temple and palace. To read and write was to hold a kind of magic, to transform clay into authority. A scribe could fix a debt, mark a boundary, proclaim a law. In his hands, symbols became binding, carrying the weight of gods and kings alike. The written word created permanence in a world where memory could fade, disputes could multiply, and truth could be contested. Writing anchored society in ways that no spoken oath could match. Uruk was also a city of craftsmen. Potters shaped vessels on fast-turning wheels, producing in hours what once took days. Smiths hammered copper into tools sharper and stronger than stone. Jewelers set lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, into ornaments that gleamed with exotic brilliance. Carvers etched cylinder seals, intricate images rolled onto clay to mark ownership and identity. Each object was more than a tool or decoration. It was a sign of specialization, of a society where individuals could devote themselves to single crafts because others labored to provide their food. The city allowed for the first time the flowering of diverse skills, woven together in networks of exchange. Markets in Uruk were lively places, where merchants traded barley for wool, beer for oil, and goods from distant lands for local products. Traders followed routes stretching to Anatolia, Iran, and beyond, bringing obsidian, timber, stone, and metals into the city. In return, they carried textiles, grain, and crafted goods outward. The city became not only a local hub, but a node in a vast web of exchange. To walk the streets of Uruk was to encounter voices speaking different tongues, goods from distant lands, and ideas carried across mountains and deserts. The sheer density of Uruk created challenges never faced before. Waste had to be managed, water distributed, streets kept passable, and disputes resolved. Councils of elders likely deliberated on community matters, while assemblies of citizens debated decisions. But alongside these, rulers arose whose authority went beyond consensus. Priest-kings claimed legitimacy from both gods and people, directing labor for monumental projects and commanding armies to defend territory. They were not merely leaders of households, but figures who embodied the city itself, representing its unity, its power, and its divine sanction. War became more organized in this new urban world. As villages grew into cities, boundaries blurred, and competition for land, water, and trade routes intensified. Fortifications rose, with walls of mud brick encircling the settlements. Armies of soldiers equipped with spears, shields, and early chariots clashed on the plains. Victory brought not only spoils, but also control of irrigation systems and farmland. In this crucible of conflict, kingship solidified. Leaders who defended their people successfully became indispensable, their authority woven into both survival and sacred order. Religion was inseparable from this process. Each city elevated its patron deity, declaring itself chosen by the divine. In Uruk, the goddess Inanna, fierce and complex, presided as both the bringer of fertility and the goddess of war. Her temple stood as a testament to her dual nature, embodying the paradox of creation and destruction that defined life itself. Rituals dedicated to her were dramatic and lavish, involving music, dance, offerings, and at times symbolic unions between priestesses and kings, enacting the sacred marriage that bound the prosperity of land and people to divine favor. The mythology that grew from Uruk, Oss culture, became the seedbed for later Mesopotamian thought. Tales of gods shaping humans from clay, of floods sent to cleanse the earth, of heroes seeking immortality, all found their beginnings in these early centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though compiled centuries later, drew upon stories of a real king of Uruk, remembered for both his grandeur and his tyranny. In his legend, the concerns of humanity are laid bare, the fear of death, the longing for friendship, the search for meaning. Uruk was not only the first city of walls and temples, but the first city of stories, myths that would echo across ages. The physical landscape of Uruk revealed its growing complexity. Dense neighborhoods of houses stretched outward from temple precincts, workshops clustered near canals, where raw materials arrived by boat. Marketplaces thrived in open squares. Roads radiated from central plazas, some paved with stone, others hardened with packed earth. The city pulsed with constant motion. Herds driven through gates, carts laden with goods creaking along paths, children fetching water from canals, priests chanting in temple halls, artisans hammering, carving, shaping. The hum of urban life, once unimaginable, became the daily reality of tens of thousands. Social divisions deepened within this environment. At the top stood the rulers and priests, who directed labor, collected tribute, and proclaimed laws. Below them were scribes, administrators, and merchants, whose skills placed them in positions of influence. Craftsmen formed a broad middle, their expertise valued, and their livelihood steady. Farmers and laborers, the largest class, sustained the city through toil in fields and workshops. At the bottom were slaves, often captives of war, or debtors, unable to pay what they owed. Though slavery in this era was less pervasive than in later times, its shadow had already fallen across human society. Women held important roles in this world, though their freedoms varied. In temple service, priestesses played central roles in ritual, some commanding respect and wealth equal to male counterparts. Women could own property, run businesses, and manage households. In marriage, arranged by families, they bore responsibilities for maintaining alliances and producing heirs. The balance of power was uneven, but the presence of female figures in myth and temple suggests that women's influence, though constrained, was still deeply woven into the fabric of society. The innovations of Uruk extended into mathematics and astronomy. To manage irrigation, fields, and trade, systems of measurement grew increasingly precise. Clay tablets recorded quantities of grain, weights of silver, lengths of land. From these practical needs emerged number systems based on 60, a legacy still with us in the 60 minutes of an hour and the 360 degrees of a circle. Astronomers watching the skies for signs from the gods recorded the cycles of stars and planets, laying foundations for both astrology and science. The impact of Uruk spread outward across Mesopotamia and beyond. Colonies were established in distant regions, carrying the city's architecture, art, and writing far from its home. The so-called Uruk expansion saw its influence stretch across Syria, Anatolia, and Iran as merchants, priests, and settlers brought with them the tools of urban life. In these outposts, local traditions blended with Mesopotamian innovations, creating hybrid cultures that extended the reach of civilization. Uruk was not immortal. Its dominance waned as other cities rose, as rivalries fractured unity, as new powers emerged. But its legacy endured. The concept of the city as a center of power, economy, religion, and culture was born there. The blueprint of civilization, temples, palaces, writing, law, trade, specialization, was drawn in its streets. Every city that followed, from Babylon to Rome, from Athens to Baghdad, carried in its foundation a piece of Uruk's vision. The age of Uruk was a turning point. Humanity had moved beyond survival, beyond village life, into a new existence defined by scale, complexity, and ambition. The city was a living organism, fed by the fields, watered by the canals, pulsing with the labor of thousands, guided by gods and kings. It was a creation greater than any one person, greater than any single generation. In Uruk, the idea of civilization itself took form, and from its walls began the long, unbroken story of the urban world in which we still live today. Kings, warfare, and the birth of empire. The city was humanity's boldest invention, but once tens of thousands of people were gathered behind walls, the question of power could no longer be avoided. Who would command the labor that dug canals and built temples? Who would lead when enemies threatened the gates? Who would speak with the authority of gods and men alike? In Mesopotamia, the answer gave rise to one of history's most enduring figures, the king. His emergence was not sudden, but the result of centuries of conflict, organization, and belief. And with him came warfare, conquest, and the first attempts to bind cities into empires. Life in early cities demanded coordination on a scale that kinship alone could not provide. Irrigation networks stretched for miles, requiring thousands of workers to maintain. Fields had to be surveyed, taxes collected, disputes judged, markets regulated, temples supplied. At first, Councils of elders likely deliberated. Assemblies of free men perhaps voiced concerns. And priests guided decisions by invoking divine will. But when danger loomed, when floods threatened, or enemies gathered on the horizon, decisive leadership was essential. Out of this necessity arose individuals whose authority extended beyond consensus. They were chosen to command armies, to organize defenses, to enforce order. Over time, their temporary authority hardened into permanent office. The king was born. The kings of early Mesopotamia did not present themselves as ordinary men elevated by circumstance. They cloaked themselves in sacred legitimacy. Their crowns and robes were not merely symbols of rank, but signs of divine favor. They declared themselves shepherds appointed by the gods to care for their people, judges to enforce divine justice, warriors chosen to defend sacred lands. Their words carried weight not only because they commanded armies, but because they were believed to speak with heaven's authority. In this fusion of the sacred and the political lay the foundation of monarchy for millennia to come. The rise of kingship was intertwined with the rise of warfare. As cities grew, competition for resources sharpened. Fields and canals were life itself, and neighboring settlements often clashed over them. Raiding became more organized, not a skirmish of hunters, but a campaign of soldiers armed with spears, axes, and shields. Walls rose higher, gates were fortified, and weapons improved. The earliest kings were almost always war leaders, their power justified by their ability to protect or to conquer. Victory was proof of divine blessing, defeat a sign of divine anger. Archaeological evidence from the city of Ur tells this story with stark clarity. The royal cemetery, dating from around 2500 BCE, contains graves filled with weapons, armor, and the remains of retainers who followed their lords into death. In one famous tomb, the so-called Great Death Pit, dozens of servants, musicians, and guards lay buried alongside their ruler, sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife. This was kingship expressed through ritual and violence, a display of power both earthly and cosmic. The king was more than a leader in life. He was a figure whose death demanded the loyalty of others, even beyond the grave. The kings also left their mark in stone. Carved stelae and reliefs depict rulers towering above enemies, weapons raised in triumph, prisoners bound and kneeling at their feet. These images were not mere records but propaganda, visual declarations of dominance. They proclaimed that the king was the bulwark against chaos, the guardian of order, the chosen of the gods. To oppose him was to oppose both divine will and human strength. Warfare itself evolved as cities grew. At first, armies were little more than levies of farmers summoned in times of danger. They carried spears and axes, protected by wicker shields. But as conflicts became more frequent, specialization followed. Some men became soldiers year-round, supported by temple and palace. Chariots drawn by donkeys thundered across plains, carrying archers who rained arrows from above. Commanders learned to maneuver units, to besiege walls, to cut off supplies. War was no longer an interruption of life, but a central part of it, shaping economies, societies, and politics. With conquest came tribute. Victorious kings demanded grain, livestock, and labor from defeated cities. These flows of wealth enriched palaces and temples, financing further campaigns and monumental projects. The cycle fed itself. War produced wealth. Wealth financed armies. Armies conquered more land. For the first time, the idea of empire emerged. Not just a single city ruling itself, but one city ruling many. One of the earliest attempts at empire was forged by the city of Kish, often remembered in Sumerian tradition as the seat of kingship after the Great Flood. From Kish, rulers extended their control over surrounding towns, claiming the title King of Kish as a symbol of dominance. Other cities, such as Uruk and Lagash, followed similar paths, each seeking to impose authority beyond their walls. The struggle for supremacy was constant, with alliances shifting, rivalries flaring, and kings proclaiming their conquests, in inscriptions that still speak from broken tablets. The conflict between the cities of Lagash and Umma illustrates the new realities of this world. They fought over fertile fields watered by shared canals, each claiming divine right to the land. Kings led armies against one another, and victories were commemorated in monuments. One such monument, the Stele of the Vultures, shows the king of Lagash marching in triumph, his soldiers in disciplined formation, his enemies trampled underfoot. It is one of the earliest visual records of organized warfare, a reminder that the same irrigation systems that gave life could also spark death. As kings expanded their power, their role extended beyond war. They became lawgivers, issuing decrees to regulate society. Clay tablets record judgments on disputes, rules for trade, penalties for theft, and protections for widows and orphans. These were not abstract musings, but practical attempts to bring order to growing complex societies. The king was not only a warrior, but a judge, the embodiment of justice as well as might. Kingship also transformed architecture. Palaces rose beside temples, sprawling complexes of halls, courtyards, and storerooms. Unlike temples, which belonged to the gods, palaces proclaimed human authority. Their walls were adorned with scenes of banquets, hunts, and victories, celebrations of royal power. The palace was both home and government, both private residence and public stage. Within its walls, scribes recorded taxes, officials issued orders, servants prepared feasts, and foreign envoys presented gifts. The king's household was the state itself, and his authority extended into every corner of society. The ideology of kingship found expression in myth. Stories told of rulers chosen by the gods, of kings who built cities at divine command, of monarchs who ascended to the heavens after death. The figure of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, embodies this fusion of history and myth. Whether or not a historical Gilgamesh ruled, the stories about him captured the anxieties and hopes of kingship, the desire for immortality, the struggle with tyranny, the balance between strength and wisdom. Through such tales, kingship was woven into the fabric of culture, justified not only by force but by narrative. But the rise of kings and warfare carried costs. Common people bore the burden of taxes and labor, their grain filling storehouses, their sons filling armies. Defeats brought devastation. Cities burned, fields destroyed, populations enslaved. The glory of kings was purchased with the toil and suffering of thousands, and for every victory carved in stone, there were countless losses unrecorded, forgotten, but endured. Still, the institution of kingship endured because it answered a fundamental need. In a world of uncertainty, of floods and droughts, of enemies and rivalries, people sought security, order, and leadership. The king promised these, embodying the strength of warriors, the wisdom of elders, the authority of priests. He stood at the crossroads of heaven and earth, mediator between gods and people, commander of armies, judge of disputes, master of ceremonies. In him, the complexity of the city found focus. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia had become a patchwork of city-states, each with its king, each vying for dominance, each proclaiming divine sanction. Empires rose and fell in rapid succession, as rulers extended control, lost it, and saw rivals take their place. The dream of uniting all Mesopotamia under one crown remained elusive, but the ambition itself marked a turning point. Human beings had begun to conceive of political power on a scale larger than any one city, larger than any one community. The birth of empire had begun, and from this crucible of kings and wars, the stage was set for even greater experiments in power. The struggles of these early rulers laid the groundwork for dynasties that would endure for centuries, for codes of law that would shape justice for millennia, and for empires whose shadows would fall across all of history. The king, born from necessity, armed with divine sanction, and sharpened by war, had become the central figure of human civilization, and in his rise lay both the promise of order and the peril of domination. The first laws and justice in Mesopotamia. As Mesopotamia's cities grew larger and more complex, the questions of survival were no longer only about food, water, or defense. They were about fairness, order, and control. How could thousands of people bound together not by kinship, but by geography, coexist without collapsing into chaos?
How could trade be trusted, debts repaid, crimes punished, and disputes settled? These were problems no village elder or single priest could handle alone. The answer was law. And in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, humanity took its first great steps toward written codes of justice. Long before the famous Code of Hammurabi, law already pulsed through daily life. The act of carving rules into clay tablets was simply the final expression of a tradition that stretched back to the first councils of elders who settled quarrels beneath the open sky. As early as the 4th millennium BCE, temple and palace officials were recording transactions, contracts, and agreements in cuneiform script. These were not lofty pronouncements about morality, but practical records. A measure of barley lent from one man to another, a field leased for planting, a bride price agreed upon between families. Justice began in these ordinary exchanges, in the need to fix obligations so that trust could extend beyond personal relationships. In the city of Nippur, tablets from around 2100 BCE preserve some of the earliest legal rulings. A widow sought protection for her inheritance. A merchant demanded repayment of silver. A farmer claimed his neighbor diverted water from a shared canal. These disputes were brought before judges, often appointed by the king, and decisions were inscribed into clay. Once recorded, they became precedent. Others could point to them, cite them, rely upon them. Law moved from the fragile realm of memory into the permanence of writing. The authority behind these rulings was never presented as merely human. Kings claimed that the gods themselves had charged them with enforcing justice. In inscriptions, rulers described themselves as shepherds, appointed to protect the weak, defenders of widows and orphans, guardians of fairness. This divine sanction gave weight to their decrees, framing justice not as a negotiation among men, but as an extension of cosmic order. To obey the law was to align with the will of heaven. To break it was to invite divine anger. One of the earliest surviving law codes is attributed to Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, around 2100 BCE. Written in Sumerian, it laid down penalties for crimes such as theft, assault, and adultery. Unlike later codes, Ur-Nammu's laws often prescribed fines rather than physical punishment. A man who caused injury paid silver. A thief compensated his victim. The tone was less brutal than the eye for an eye justice that would later become famous, reflecting perhaps a society where restoring balance mattered more than exacting vengeance. These early laws reveal a desire to keep communities whole, to resolve disputes in ways that preserved harmony rather than deepened conflict. But law was not only about crime. It regulated marriage, inheritance, trade, and property. A woman's dowry was protected by statute, ensuring she retained her wealth even if widowed. Contracts for adopting children were inscribed, guaranteeing care for the elderly in exchange for inheritance rights. Merchants who engaged in risky trade journeys recorded terms of partnership and profit, sharing, with penalties for betrayal. Farmers leased fields from temples or wealthy landowners, their rents and obligations spelled out in clay. Law permeated every corner of life, touching birth, marriage, work, and death. The relationship between law and economy was especially strong in Mesopotamia, where trade networks stretched far beyond city walls. Caravans carried goods across deserts. Boats sailed rivers and seas. Merchants exchanged silver, copper, textiles, and grain. Trust was essential, and trust demanded enforceable contracts. A merchant investing silver in a caravan needed assurance that profits would be shared fairly. A farmer renting land needed protection if floods destroyed his crops. Law provided the framework for risk, allowing commerce to flourish in ways impossible in its absence. Judges were central figures in this system, appointed by the king or chosen from respected elders They presided over disputes in open assemblies. Witnesses were summoned, oaths sworn, evidence examined. The process was formal, often public, ensuring that decisions carried legitimacy. To lie under oath was not merely dishonorable, but sacrilegious, for oaths were sworn before gods. Punishments for perjury were severe, reflecting the belief that truth was sacred, and law a mirror of divine order. By the 18th century BCE, the laws of Hammurabi of Babylon raised this system to new heights. Carved onto a black basalt stela, nearly 7 feet tall, displayed in a public place, his code proclaimed itself not only to the elite, but to all who could see. At the top of the monument, Hammurabi is shown receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. Below, nearly 300 laws were inscribed, covering everything from property disputes to marriage, theft to wages, assault to slavery. It is one of history's most enduring legal documents, a symbol of the fusion between divine will and human governance. The Code of Hammurabi is famous for its principle of retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But this was not the whole picture. Many laws sought to protect the vulnerable. A tenant farmer whose harvest failed because of flood was not required to pay rent that year. A widow's dowry could not be seized by her husband's family. Children of a slave woman could not be denied inheritance if recognized by their father. These provisions reveal an awareness of the fragility of life in Mesopotamia, where flood, famine, and misfortune always lurked, and where law was meant to balance power between strong and weak. The code also enshrined hierarchy. Punishments were not equal for all, but depended on social rank. If a noble injured another noble, the penalty was equal retaliation. If a noble injured a commoner, he paid a fine. If a noble struck a slave, the punishment was less severe. Still, justice was stratified, reflecting a society deeply conscious of class and status. Law was not blind. It saw sharply who was rich, who was poor, who was free, who was enslaved. Even so, the very existence of a written code represented a monumental advance. It declared that justice was not arbitrary but fixed, that rules existed outside the whims of rulers, that order could be known and preserved. In a world where power was often brutal and uncertain, this was revolutionary. The law stood as a promise, however imperfect, that life would be governed by principles, not only by force. The influence of Mesopotamian law spread across time and space. Later Hebrew traditions preserved in the Torah bear echoes of Hammurabi's code. Concepts of retribution, contracts, and protections for widows and orphans carried into biblical law, into Greek and Roman thought, and eventually into the legal traditions that shape the modern world. What began as clay tablets in temple storehouses grew into a legacy that outlived empires, cities, and kings. But behind these grand codes lay the daily lives of ordinary people. A woman negotiating her dowry, a farmer signing a lease, a merchant sealing a contract, a judge listening to testimony. These were the true substance of law. In their voices and actions, the great abstractions of justice were made real. The law was not just words carved into stone, but the lived experience of communities trying to find order in the face of complexity. The rise of law in Mesopotamia was inseparable from the rise of writing, the rise of cities, the rise of kingship. It was a response to new problems created by scale, diversity, and ambition. Without law, trust would fracture, trade would collapse, disputes would fester into violence. With law, imperfect though it was, society could hold together, grow, and aspire to greater heights. The clay tablets of Mesopotamian judges are fragile, but the ideas they preserved, fairness, accountability, authority, precedent, are among humanity's most enduring achievements. When we read the laws of Hammurabi or Ur-Nammu today, they can seem harsh, even cruel. To lose a hand for theft, to be executed for perjury, to suffer unequal penalties for the same crime depending on class, These punishments speak of a world far removed from ours. But to those who lived then, these codes were bulwarks against the uncertainty of life. Assurances that wrongs could be righted, that disputes could be settled, that order could prevail. They gave shape to the human longing for justice, a longing as old as the first quarrel and as enduring as civilization itself. Mesopotamia's rivers watered fields, but its laws watered society. They allowed thousands of strangers to live together, to trade, to marry, to inherit, to trust. They provided stability across generations, carrying memory in clay, so that the wisdom of one age could guide the next. And in doing so, they gave humanity one of its greatest gifts, the belief that life could be, governed not only by strength or chance, but by rules written and enduring, binding and sacred, trade, wealth, and the first economies. When the first seeds were pressed into the soil, and the first herds were penned inside crude enclosures, the foundations of a new way of life were laid. But agriculture alone did not create civilization. Fields provided food, temples provided order, kings provided authority, but it was trade that breathed movement into the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. It was trade that tied them together, that carried goods across deserts and rivers, that brought distant lands into conversation with one another. The rise of trade created the first true economies, systems of wealth that extended beyond survival, systems that bound people into obligations of debt, credit, and exchange. From the beginning, Mesopotamia was a land both blessed and limited. Its rivers brought fertile soil but little stone, little timber, few metals to build, to forge, to adorn. Its people needed more than what lay at hand. Clay was abundant, so bricks could be shaped, fired, and stacked into walls. Reeds grew in marshes, so mats, boats, and baskets could be woven. But for copper, tin, gold, and precious stones, for strong wood to roof palaces and temples, for the luxury goods that marked status, Mesopotamians looked outward. Out of necessity, they became traders. And from necessity, they built networks that reached farther than any earlier culture had attempted. The earliest exchanges were local: grain for fish, wool for pottery, milk for baskets. But as villages grew into towns and towns into cities, surplus allowed specialization. Farmers no longer consumed all they grew. They brought their excess to markets. Artisans no longer worked only for their households. They produced goods to sell. Markets became regular gatherings where people met to barter, haggle, and trade. The sound of commerce filled plazas and courtyards, the clink of copper scales measuring silver, the murmur of voices agreeing upon prices. Silver soon became the standard measure of value, not coined money, but weighed pieces, cut and balanced on scales, marked debts and payments. A shekel of silver could buy a measure of barley, a slave, or the rent of a field. Contracts written on clay tablets recorded these transactions, listing amounts, deadlines, and witnesses. Debt was a familiar presence, binding people together in webs of obligation. A farmer might borrow silver to lease oxen, promising repayment after harvest. A merchant might borrow to finance a caravan, pledging profit in return. When debts could not be repaid, land, goods, and even family members could be seized. The economy was vibrant but unforgiving. Long-distance trade carried Mesopotamian goods across the ancient world. Boats plied the Euphrates and Tigris, laden with woolen textiles, jars of oil, and barrels of beer. Caravans set out across deserts, donkeys laden with goods, merchants walking beside them for weeks at a time. From the mountains of Anatolia came silver and timber. From Iran came copper and semi-precious stones. From the Gulf arrived shells, dates, and pearls. From far-off Afghanistan came the deep blue of lapis lazuli, prized for jewelry and sacred art. The presence of these materials in Mesopotamian graves and temples reveals the reach of their trade, stretching hundreds and even thousands of miles. Uruk and Ur grew wealthy from this movement of goods. Their temples became centers of economic management, collecting surplus from farmers, storing it, redistributing it, and directing trade.
Palaces, too, grew into hubs of wealth, employing scribes to record shipments, guards to protect caravans, and officials to negotiate agreements with neighboring cities. The economy was not separate from religion or politics. It was woven into both, inseparable from the structures of power. To trade was to serve temple and king, and to enrich oneself within their shadow. The invention of writing was born partly from this economic need. Clay tokens once stood for sheep, jars, or measures of grain. Pressed into envelopes of clay, they tracked debts and obligations. In time, the marks themselves replaced the tokens, becoming symbols pressed into tablets. The earliest cuneiform texts are not hymns or myths, but lists, rations for workers, inventories of goods, tallies of livestock. The first accountants, bending over their tablets in temple storehouses, were unwitting pioneers of literacy. The story of civilization begins not with poetry, but with receipts. Trade transformed social life as well. Merchants became a distinct class, moving between city and caravan, between temple and market. Some grew rich, their houses filled with foreign luxuries. Others fell into ruin when ventures failed, their debts crushing them. Partnerships flourished, where several men pooled resources to fund a risky journey. Profits could be high, but losses devastating. Risk was the constant companion of the merchant, as bandits, storms, and dishonest partners could reduce fortunes to nothing. The economy also deepened inequalities. Wealth accumulated in temples and palaces, where priests and kings controlled vast lands, herds, and workshops. Ordinary farmers often worked land owned by these institutions, paying rent in grain and labor. Craftsmen depended on temple contracts for their livelihoods. Slavery grew as war captives and debtors were forced into service. While some prospered, others sank into dependence, their freedom constrained by obligations to the powerful. The wealth of Mesopotamian cities glittered brightly, but it cast long shadows. Despite these hardships, the prosperity of trade supported culture and innovation. Surplus wealth financed the construction of temples and ziggurats, the carving of statues, the composition of hymns. Musicians played in palace courts because farmers filled granaries. Scribes recorded myths because merchants demanded contracts. Art and literature were sustained by the hum of commerce, by the flow of silver and barley, by the endless exchange that turned survival into prosperity. Markets became places not only of trade, but of encounter. Farmers brought their produce, artisans their wares, merchants their goods from distant lands. Gossip spread along with grain. News of wars, of omens, of decrees echoed through stalls. Languages mingled, customs blended. The market was the city's pulse, the place where its diversity became visible, where strangers became neighbors through the act of exchange. The role of women in this economy was significant. Many worked in temple workshops, weaving textiles that became Mesopotamia's most important export. Some managed businesses, lending silver, running taverns, owning land. Widows could inherit property. Mothers could arrange contracts for children. Priestesses could oversee temple estates. Though often constrained by law and custom, women were active participants in the economy, their labor and enterprise essential to its functioning. The reach of Mesopotamian trade even influenced other cultures. Colonies established during the Uruk period carried Mesopotamian pottery, seals, and writing systems far into Anatolia and Syria. Local peoples adapted these tools, blending them with their own traditions. Exchange was not only material, but cultural, spreading ideas of urban life, writing, and organized religion. Mesopotamia became the beating heart of a network that extended across much of the ancient Near East. Wealth brought splendor, but also temptation. Kings taxed heavily to fund wars and palaces. Temples demanded offerings that drained households. Debts piled upon farmers, until they lost land and freedom. From time to time, rulers proclaimed debt cancellations, wiping tablets clean to restore balance.
and prevent collapse. These clean slate decrees were not acts of mercy alone, but of pragmatism, for a society crushed by debt could not function, and a population reduced to despair could not support its rulers. Through all this, the economy remained anchored in the rhythms of the rivers. No matter how far caravans traveled, or how much silver changed hands, the wealth of Mesopotamia still flowed from the fertile fields watered by canals. Each harvest was both the foundation and the gamble of the year. A good flood filled granaries. A poor one brought scarcity. Trade magnified abundance and mitigated disaster. But the core truth remained. Without the rivers, without the soil, there would be no wealth, no trade, no cities. The legacy of these first economies endures in ways we scarcely notice. The division of labor, the use of contracts, the reliance on silver as a standard of value, the concept of interest on loans, the management of surplus by institutions, all began here, in the land between two rivers. Mesopotamia did not invent the desire for exchange, but it built the first systems that could sustain it, on a grand scale. In the crowded markets of Uruk, or beneath the watchful gaze of temple and palace, humanity discovered that wealth was more than grain and livestock. It was trust, obligation, credit, and debt. It was networks that stretched across horizons. It was the power to shape not only survival but destiny. Trade bound strangers together, created systems that outlasted lifetimes, and gave birth to economies that still echo in the coins in our pockets and the contracts we sign today. Gods, myths, and the cosmic order. The fields and canals of Mesopotamia gave life. The markets and workshops gave wealth. The kings and palaces gave order. But none of these alone could explain the world to the people who lived within it. Floods could come without warning. Plagues could sweep through streets. Storms could flatten crops. And war could erase whole cities in days. To live in such uncertainty was to search for meaning beyond what the eye could see. Out of this longing grew the myths and gods of Mesopotamia, a vast web of stories and beliefs that bound heaven and earth together, that gave pattern to chaos and comfort to fear. For the people of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, the divine was everywhere. Every gust of wind carried the breath of a god. Every flood was a sign of their power. Every birth or death, a ripple in the great cosmic order. The gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences, unpredictable and commanding, as real as the riverbanks and the rising sun. In their temples, they were fed, clothed, and honored. In their myths, they loved, quarreled, punished, and protected. To worship them was not optional. It was the very condition of survival. The pantheon was immense, but at its heart were figures whose names resounded through centuries. Anu, the father of the heavens, sat at the summit of divine hierarchy. Enlil, lord of the winds, commanded storms and decreed fates. Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, brought invention and knowledge, guiding humanity in survival. Inanna, fierce goddess of love and war, embodied both creation and destruction, passion and chaos. Shamash, the sun, brought light and justice. Sin, the moon, marked the months. Ishtar, later merging with Inanna, raged as both lover and warrior. To each god was assigned a domain, but their actions spilled across boundaries, reflecting the complexity of human life itself. Myth was the language through which these powers were understood. Stories were told not only to entertain, but to explain why the rivers flooded, why the stars moved, why kings ruled, why death was inescapable. In the myth of creation, the universe began not with peace, but with conflict. The primordial waters personified as Apsu and Tiamat mingled and birthed the first gods. But strife followed as younger gods rebelled against their parents. Marduk, champion of order, rose to slay Tiamat, the monstrous embodiment of chaos, splitting her body to form the heavens and the earth. From her eyes flowed the rivers, from her ribs the mountains. In this story, the world itself was born from violence, its stability always precarious. always threatened by the forces of disorder. Humanity in these myths was not created for glory, but for labor.
The gods, wearied by the burden of maintaining the cosmos, fashioned humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain divine being. Our purpose was clear: to feed the gods, to serve them, to ease their toil. Each temple meal, each sacrifice, was a repayment of that debt. In this vision, life was not a gift, but a responsibility, and the relationship between gods and humans was one of dependency and obligation. To neglect the gods was to invite catastrophe. The myths also explored the mysteries of mortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the great literary treasure of Mesopotamia, captured the human confrontation with death. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, strong and restless, sought immortality after the death of his beloved companion Enkidu. He journeyed across mountains and seas, braving scorpion men, crossing the waters of death, seeking the secret of eternal life. But in the end, he found none. Even heroes must die, and only the walls of Uruk, the works of human hands, endure. The epic did not promise heaven or salvation, but accepted mortality as inescapable. Its lesson was stark. Life is fleeting, but in friendship, in love, in creation, there lies meaning. Religion in Mesopotamia was not confined to stories. It was enacted daily through ritual, prayer, and offering. Priests bathed the statues of gods each morning, clothed them in fine garments, laid meals before them, sang hymns, and burned incense. Festivals filled the city streets with processions, music, and feasting. During the New Year festival in Babylon, the statue of Marduk was paraded through the city, reaffirming his supremacy and the king's divine mandate. Ritual was the rhythm of civic life, binding individuals into a shared performance of devotion. Astrology and divination also grew from this religious worldview. The skies above Mesopotamia were read as a great tablet upon which the gods wrote their will. Priests observed the movements of planets and stars, linking them to the fates of kings and kingdoms. The appearance of a comet, the eclipse of the sun, the position of Venus, all were signs, messages that could guide decisions in war and peace. Liver divination, the examination of animal entrails, sought to read the gods' intentions in the very organs of life. Omens were everywhere, and to ignore them was folly. In these practices, religion and science intertwined, for the careful observation of the heavens that served divination also laid the foundations for astronomy. Every city claimed a special relationship with its patron god. Uruk exalted Inanna. Ur honored Nana, the moon god. Eridu revered Enki. Nippur gave itself to Enlil. Temples dedicated to these deities dominated skylines, their platforms raised higher with each generation, their ziggurats ascending like stairways to heaven. To belong to a city was to belong to its god. War between cities was not only a clash of armies, but a contest between divine patrons. Victory meant not only military strength, but divine favor. Defeat was interpreted as the abandonment of a god. The order of the cosmos was mirrored in the order of society. Just as gods ruled over heavens and earth, so kings ruled over people, priests over temples, fathers over households. Hierarchy was sacred, a reflection of cosmic truth. Law, as carved into Hammurabi's stela, declared itself given by Shamash, god of justice. To break the law was not only a crime against men, but a sin against heaven. Justice itself was divine, and to uphold it was to maintain harmony between the earthly and the celestial. Death brought not paradise, but shadow. The Mesopotamians believed in an underworld where souls dwelled after leaving the body, a dark, dusty realm beneath the earth. There the dead ate clay and drank dirty water, stripped of vitality and joy. Only through offerings from the living could they find relief. Small comforts of food and drink, carried to them by ritual. Ancestors were not gone, but dependent on their family's devotion. To neglect the dead was to doom them to thirst in the shadows, and to honor them was to keep bonds alive across generations.
These beliefs shaped daily life. Families kept small altars in their homes where libations were poured for ancestors. Farmers prayed before planting, merchants before journeys, mothers before childbirth. The divine was invoked at every turn, woven into work, family, and community. Religion was not a compartment of life, but the framework of existence itself. Over centuries, myths shifted. Gods rose and fell in prominence, but the underlying vision endured. The universe was a fragile order, carved from chaos, sustained by divine will and human service. Humanity was small, mortal, subject to forces beyond comprehension, but capable of pleasing the gods through devotion, of building cities that reflected cosmic harmony, and of finding dignity even in the face of death. The legacy of Mesopotamian religion is vast. The story of a flood sent to cleanse the world appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh and echoes later in Hebrew scripture. The image of humans shaped from clay appears in both Mesopotamian myth and biblical tradition. The practice of reading stars as signs of destiny gave birth to astrology, still alive in countless forms. The very concept of law as divine justice, of kingship as sacred trust, of temples as the heart of community, all trace roots to this ancient land. Between the rivers, in the hymns sung to Inanna, in the prayers carved into tablets, in the myths told by firelight, the people of Mesopotamia found their place in the cosmos. They lived with uncertainty, but through gods and myths, they gave that uncertainty shape. They feared death, but through stories, they gave it meaning. They toiled in fields and canals, but through ritual, they elevated that toil into service of the divine. Their myths were not mere tales. They were the scaffolding of civilization, the framework upon which human order was built, the cosmic mirror in which they saw themselves reflected. The gods of Mesopotamia may no longer be worshipped, their temples long since fallen into ruin, their names whispered now only by scholars and storytellers. But the questions they answered about life, death, order, and chaos remain with us. Their myths still echo not only in scriptures and legends that came after, but in the human search for meaning itself. And it was in Mesopotamia, under the blazing sun and the star-filled skies, that this great conversation between humanity and the divine first took form, shaping the destiny of civilizations to come. The rise of empires and the Akkadian Age, the age of city-states in Mesopotamia, was a time of brilliance and fragility. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish rose with astonishing creativity, but each stood alone, vying with neighbors for water, trade routes, and honor. Temples grew larger, palaces more ambitious, armies sharper, but unity was fleeting. For centuries, the southern plain was a patchwork quilt of competing powers, each claiming to be the true heart of Sumer. This constant rivalry bred innovation, but it also bred weakness. For every temple that rose, a wall was torn down in war. For every alliance, betrayal lurked close behind. Out of this fractured world, a new force emerged, one that would change the nature of power forever. It began in the north, in a land where the Tigris bent around fertile plains, near what is now Baghdad. This was not Sumer, though deeply influenced by it. These people spoke a different tongue, Semitic rather than Sumerian. Their culture blended the traditions of the south with their own rugged independence. They lived in the shadow of Sumer's greatness, but they were not bound by its endless rivalries. And from among them rose a man who would shake the world, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon's origins were wrapped in legend. Later stories claimed he was the child of a humble woman, perhaps a temple servant, who set her infant afloat on the Euphrates in a reed basket sealed with pitch. He drifted downriver until rescued by a gardener who raised him as his own. From this obscure beginning, Sargon supposedly rose to the position of cupbearer to the king of Kish, a servant close to power, but not of royal blood. The tale echoes with myth, but beneath it lies a truth.
Sargon was not born to rule. He seized it. Around 2334 BCE, through intrigue or revolt, Sargon overthrew his master in Kish. But unlike other usurpers who had come and gone, he did not stop with one throne. He looked southward to the Sumerian cities and saw a land ripe for conquest. For centuries, no city had managed to dominate the others for long. Sargon, however, possessed vision, discipline, and ruthless determination. His armies, hardened and loyal, marched with precision. City after city fell before him. Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. In a sweep of campaigns, he dismantled the independence of the south and proclaimed something unheard of in Mesopotamia, an empire. The very idea was revolutionary. The city-state was the traditional unit of Mesopotamian life. Each city had its god, its temple, its ruler, its traditions. To bind them under a single power was an audacious step, one that broke with centuries of custom. But Sargon understood something his rivals did not. Control could be centralized, rather than allowing conquered rulers to remain in place, as had often been done. He replaced them with his own governors, often drawn from his family or trusted circle. Tribute flowed, not to many shrines, but to one palace, his palace. The political map of Mesopotamia had been redrawn from his new capital, Akkad, whose exact location remains lost to archaeologists, though it surely stood near modern Baghdad. Sargon ruled a realm stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Inscribed stele claimed he washed his weapons in both seas, a boastful but telling sign of the empire's reach. For the first time in history, a single authority controlled not just a city or region, but a vast multi-ethnic, multilingual territory. With this empire came profound changes. Trade, long fragmented by local rivalries, expanded under imperial security. Caravans crossed deserts, carrying woolen textiles, grain, and oil from Mesopotamia, in exchange for timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, silver from Anatolia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Akkadian merchants moved with unprecedented confidence, shielded by imperial power. The wealth of Akkad was legendary, its palaces adorned with goods from lands once thought impossibly distant. Administration grew more complex. Scribes in Akkad expanded the Cuneiform script, adapting it to the Semitic Akkadian language while preserving Sumerian as a scholarly tongue. The empire became bilingual. Sumerian remained the language of religion and tradition, while Akkadian became the language of power. Clay tablets multiplied, recording taxes, grain rations, diplomatic letters, and royal decrees. The empire's bureaucracy was a machine turning human effort into state power. Religion, too, shifted. While Sumerian gods remained honored, Sargon elevated Ishtar, the Semitic equivalent of Inanna, to a position of supreme prominence. She became the empire's patroness, the divine partner of conquest. Priests in conquered cities continued their rituals, but the empire's propaganda framed victory as the will of Ishtar, channeled through Sargon. The blending of divine legitimacy with military conquest created a new model of rule. The king, as chosen by the gods, not only for one city, but for the entire known world. But empires are never built without blood. Sargon's armies marched relentlessly, suppressing rebellions, burning cities that resisted, deporting populations to break local loyalties. To the people of Sumer, the Akkadian conquerors may have seemed both awe-inspiring and oppressive. Their independence was gone, their gods subordinated to Akkad's, but their cultural brilliance did not vanish. Instead, it fused with Akkadian power, producing one of the richest syntheses in ancient history. For more than 50 years, Sargon ruled. His longevity gave the empire time to root itself, to weave its authority into the fabric of Mesopotamian life. When he died around 2279 BCE, he left behind not just conquered lands, but an entirely new idea, that the world could be united under one ruler, one system, one vision. His sons succeeded him, but it was his grandson
who would push the empire to its greatest heights. That grandson was Naram-Sin, remembered as the king who declared himself divine. His reign marked the zenith of Akkadian power. Campaigns extended the empire's borders deep into Anatolia, Iran, and beyond. Tribute poured into Akkad. The king's image appeared on monuments towering above his subjects, larger than life, crowned with the horned helmet of a god. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered centuries later, shows him striding up a mountain, trampling enemies beneath his feet, bathed in divine radiance. He was no longer merely the chosen of the gods. He was a god himself. This audacity was both brilliance and hubris. For the empire, Naram-Sin's reign was a golden age. For later generations, it became a cautionary tale. Legends told how he defied the gods by sacking the sacred city of Nippur, provoking divine wrath. Soon after, disaster struck. Invasions from the Zagros Mountains, drought, rebellion. The Gutians, mountain tribes dismissed as barbarians, swarmed into the heartland. Cities rebelled. Canals fell into disrepair. Famine stalked the land. Within a century of Sargon's rise, the empire crumbled. Akkad's capital, once the seat of the world's first empire, vanished into ruin, so completely that its site has never been found. But the idea of empire could not be erased. Sumerian scribes, though they cursed the Akkadians for their brutality, also recorded their achievements. Later kings from Babylon to Assyria would claim to walk in Sargon's shadow. Even 2,000 years later, Assyrian rulers traced their legitimacy back to him. The Akkadian experiment had failed politically, but it succeeded culturally. It showed that cities could be bound together, that languages could merge, that the power of one throne could stretch across horizons. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire did not end Mesopotamian civilization. Instead, it began a new cycle. The Gutians ruled briefly, despised as destroyers, until native rulers of Sumer rose again, ushering in what historians call the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. Laws were codified, temples rebuilt, ziggurats raised higher than before. The lessons of Akkad were absorbed, centralization tempered with tradition, conquest balanced with piety. In this dance of rise and fall, the pattern of Mesopotamian history was set. Brilliance followed by collapse, collapse followed by rebirth, and beneath it all, the rivers flowed on, indifferent to the ambitions of kings. The Tigris and Euphrates carried the silt that sustained fields, the waters that fed cities, the floods that reminded every generation of human frailty. Empires could rise, gods could be proclaimed, monuments could be carved in stone, but the rivers endured. They were the true masters of the land, the eternal lifeblood of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian age was brief by the measure of history, but it was a turning point. For the first time, humanity had attempted to bind vast lands under one crown, to enforce order across diversity, to wield language, religion, and force as tools of empire. The experiment ended in ruin, but it left behind a model that countless rulers would try to imitate. From Mesopotamia to Rome, from Persia to Britain, every empire since has walked in the footsteps of Sargon. The Sumerian Renaissance and the age of Ur-III, the fall of the Akkadian Empire, left a vacuum in Mesopotamia. The rivers still flowed, the fields still yielded harvests, and the temples still smoked with incense. But the imperial order that had bound the land together collapsed into fragments. Inscriptions describe this period with a tone of despair. Scribes spoke of famine that turned fertile fields into wasteland, of invasions by mountain tribes, of a world where who was king and who was not king. No single power held sway. The Gutians, rough peoples from the Zagros highlands, drifted into the heartland. They ruled not with vision or administration, but with raids and tribute. Their control was loose, resented, and remembered with bitterness. Mesopotamian texts call them the dragon of the mountains, a people who knew no taboos. They collected what they could, destroyed what they could not hold, and left the great traditions of Sumer in decline. But decline in Mesopotamia never lasted forever. Out of the ruins of empire came revival. Out of fragmentation came renewal. In the southern plains where the ancient cities of Sumer still stood, new rulers arose who remembered the lessons of Akkad, but also sought to restore Sumerian traditions. Among them was a figure who became legendary, not for conquest, but for piety and art. Gudea of Lagash. Gudea ruled a modest city-state, far smaller than Akkad's former empire, but his reign marked a cultural flowering. He did not try to subdue the whole land. Instead, he turned inward to religion, architecture, and the refinement of civic life. Under his rule, Lagash became a beacon of order amid chaos. His inscriptions tell of dreams in which the gods instructed him to build temples, complete with precise architectural specifications. He claimed to follow these divine blueprints to the letter, raising sanctuaries of extraordinary grandeur. Statues of Gudea, carved from diorite stone, imported from distant lands, show him in perpetual devotion, hands clasped, head bowed, clothed in a simple robe. His image is not that of a conquering warrior, but of a humble servant of the gods. This emphasis on devotion and construction was more than personal humility. It was political. By presenting himself as a ruler guided directly by the gods, Gudea strengthened his legitimacy in a time when military power was unreliable. He cultivated trade networks to bring in stone, wood, and metals, enriching his city without large-scale warfare. The prosperity of Lagash under his leadership showed that even in troubled times, Sumerian traditions of piety, art, and administration could thrive. But the true renaissance of Sumer came not in Lagash, but in the city of Ur. Here, a dynasty arose that sought to reunite Mesopotamia not with the brutal force of Sargon, but with a balance of centralization and tradition. Its founder was Ur-Nammu, who seized power around 2112 BCE. He expelled the Gutians from the land, restored order to the south, and laid the foundation for what historians now call the Third Dynasty of Ur. Ur-Nammu's rule was revolutionary in its emphasis on law. The earliest surviving legal code in history bears his name. Though fragmentary, the Code of Ur-Nammu reveals a sophisticated vision of justice. Unlike later laws that often emphasized retaliation in kind, Ur-Nammu's code favored fixed fines and monetary compensation. It sought to regulate property disputes, marriage, theft, and bodily injury with consistent penalties. What mattered was not vengeance, but order. In its prologue, the code declares that Ur-Nammu was chosen by the gods to establish justice in the land, to protect the weak from the strong, to ensure fairness for widows and orphans. In this, the roots of legal tradition stretch back to ziggurats and scribal houses. The dynasty also turned to monumental architecture. Ur-Nammu began, and his successors expanded, the construction of ziggurats that dominated city skylines. The ziggurat of Ur, reconstructed in part in modern times, remains one of the most iconic monuments of Mesopotamia. Rising in three massive terraces, its baked brick core ascended toward the heavens. Wide staircases climbed its flanks, leading worshippers upward, step by step, toward the temple that crowned its summit. For the people of Ur, the ziggurat was more than a building. It was a cosmic mountain, a link between earth and sky, a visible symbol of divine order rising out of the plain. Ur-Nammu was succeeded by his son Shulgi, who reigned for nearly half a century. Shulgi was a master of statecraft, an organizer who turned the loose unity of his father's reign into a tightly woven imperial system. He standardized weights and measures, reformed the calendar, and built a network of roads and rest stations that bound the empire together. Messengers could carry royal commands swiftly from city to city, linking the farthest provinces to the capital. He reorganized taxation, ensuring that grain and goods flowed steadily into royal and temple storehouses. He strengthened scribal schools, elevating the role of literacy in administration. Under Shulgi, the bureaucracy of Mesopotamia reached a level of sophistication unmatched in the ancient world. But Shulgi was not content to be a mere administrator. He cultivated an image of extraordinary personal power. In royal inscriptions, he boasted of his ability to run vast distances in a single day, carrying offerings between temples miles apart. He declared himself divine, joining the ranks of the gods while still alive. Temples to his cult were raised across the empire. Songs praised him not only as a ruler, but as a god of wisdom, justice, and protection. Like his grandfather Naram-Sin of Akkad, he sought to blur the line between man and God. But where Naram-Sin was remembered as arrogant, Shulgi framed his divinity as a continuation of piety, a fulfillment of his father's vision. The Ur-3 state was highly centralized, but it relied on a careful balance with local traditions. Provincial governors managed territories, but they were closely monitored by royal officials. Regular inspections ensured loyalty, while scribes documented every transaction, from temple donations to labor assignments. The scale of record-keeping was immense. Tens of thousands of tablets from this era survive, listing grain rations, tax receipts, and temple inventories. They reveal a society in which administration penetrated daily life, where workers were assigned to fields, workshops, and construction projects under careful state supervision. Economically, the empire combined state control with private initiative. Large temple and palace estates employed thousands of workers to produce textiles, process grain, and manage herds. Women played a prominent role in these industries, particularly in weaving workshops. At the same time, merchants conducted independent ventures, traveling with caravans under the watch of royal agents. Trade flourished, connecting with Elam in Iran, the Indus Valley in the east, Anatolia in the north, and the Persian Gulf in the south. Culturally, the Ur-3 period was a renaissance. Literature, hymns, and myths were copied, edited, and standardized. The Sumerian language, though no longer spoken widely, was preserved as a sacred and scholarly tongue, much as Latin would later be in Europe. Priests and scribes composed hymns to gods and kings, laments for destroyed cities, and wisdom literature that explored the meaning of justice and suffering. The theological foundations of Mesopotamia were reaffirmed, but now framed in a more organized, systematic way. One distinctive form that flourished was the royal hymn. Kings were celebrated not only for their power, but for their intimacy with the gods. Hymns describe Shulgi as the beloved husband of Inanna, binding his rule to cosmic order through symbolic marriage. This blending of politics, religion, and poetry elevated kingship beyond the mundane. It was divine drama, enacted in rituals and inscribed on clay. For decades, the empire prospered. Fields yielded harvests. Temples thrived. Cities expanded. But beneath the surface, strains developed. Centralization placed heavy demands on the provinces. Governors grew ambitious, seeking more autonomy. Irrigation, the lifeblood of agriculture, suffered from overuse. Salinization crept into the soil, turning fertile land into barren patches. Grain prices soared, reflecting shortages and economic stress. At the same time, external threats grew. Nomadic groups from the western deserts, the Amorites, pressed into Mesopotamia. From the east, the Elamites in the Zagros Mountains grew restless. Under Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur, the empire unraveled. Provinces declared independence. Amorite tribes carved out territories, and the Elamites struck at the heart. In 2004 BCE, they captured Ur itself, sacked its temples, and carried the king into captivity. The ziggurat of Ur, once the pride of Sumer, stood desecrated. In laments written afterward, scribes described the destruction as cosmic tragedy. The city has been defiled. Its people live like ghosts. The Euphrates carries corpses where once it carried boats. The fall of Ur was not just political defeat. It was a spiritual wound, interpreted as the gods' abandonment. But even in ruin, the legacy of the Ur-III dynasty endured. Its legal innovations shaped later codes, including the famous laws of Hammurabi. Its administrative techniques influenced centuries of governance. Its literature preserved Sumerian tradition for future ages. The dream of a unified Mesopotamia did not die with Ur's walls. It lay dormant, waiting for new kings to seize it, new cities to claim the mantle of destiny. The Sumerian Renaissance was brief compared to the long arc of Mesopotamian history, but it was profound. It showed that collapse could give way to renewal, that traditions could be reborn even after devastation. It reaffirmed the resilience of the land between the rivers, its ability to absorb conquerors, to recover from disaster, to reinvent itself again and again. The story of Ur-III was not the end of Sumer, but the seedbed for the next great age, when a city once minor, Babylon, would rise to dominate the land and reshape the world's imagination. Babylon's first rise and the laws of Hammurabi. When the third dynasty of Ur collapsed in fire and lament, the political map of Mesopotamia fractured once more. The mighty walls of Ur lay in ruin, its ziggurats scarred, its people scattered or enslaved. Into the vacuum rushed new powers, each seeking to claim the mantle of kingship, each invoking the gods as patrons of their cause. Among these shifting forces were the Amorites, tribal groups from the deserts west of the Euphrates. For centuries, they had been viewed by settled Mesopotamians with suspicion, outsiders whose flocks grazed near fields, who moved restlessly with the seasons, who did not conform to the order of cities and canals. But when Ur fell, the Amorites moved in, not as raiders but as rulers. They adopted the tools of the scribes, the rituals of the temples, the authority of kingship. They became Mesopotamian, and in doing so, they reshaped Mesopotamia itself. One of their strongholds was Babylon, a city that until then had been of little consequence. Situated on the middle Euphrates, it was overshadowed by older, wealthier, and more sacred centers like Ur, Nippur, or Uruk. Its walls enclosed a modest town, its temples humble compared to the soaring ziggurats of the south. But under Amorite leadership, Babylon grew steadily, strengthened by shrewd rulers who navigated the dangerous balance of diplomacy, warfare, and trade. By the early 18th century BCE, a king named Hammurabi ascended Babylon's throne, and with him, the city stepped onto the world stage. Hammurabi did not inherit a vast empire. He inherited a precarious kingdom, hemmed in by rivals, Larsa to the south, Eshnunna to the east, Mari to the west, and Assyria rising in the north. Each was led by ambitious rulers. Each commanded armies. Each sought dominance. At first, Hammurabi seemed cautious. He consolidated his base, strengthened city defenses, and cultivated alliances. He invested in irrigation projects that improved agriculture and won the loyalty of farmers. He paid homage to the gods with temple renovations, securing the favor of priests. He projected the image of a just ruler, a shepherd of his people, chosen by the gods to maintain order. But beneath this careful image lay ambition. Over the course of decades, Hammurabi maneuvered masterfully, shifting alliances, exploiting weaknesses, and expanding Babylon's reach. He struck against Eshnunna, bringing its fertile lands under his sway. He defeated Mari, a city that had flourished as a hub of trade along the Euphrates, incorporating its wealth and resources. He humbled Larsa, the last great rival in the south, absorbing its territories, and proclaiming himself the unifier of Sumer and Akkad. In the north, he asserted dominance over Assyria, though the relationship was more one of influence than complete control. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi had transformed Babylon from a provincial town into the capital of an empire that spanned nearly all of Mesopotamia. This achievement was not only military, but ideological. Hammurabi presented himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. He invoked the gods, especially Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, as the true power behind his victories. Inscriptions describe Hammurabi as chosen by Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, to establish fairness in the land, to protect the weak, and to destroy the wicked. His reign was cast not as personal ambition, but as cosmic mission. This rhetoric, combined with military might, made Babylon the acknowledged center of Mesopotamian life. Hammurabi's most enduring legacy, however, was not his conquests, but his law code. Carved onto a massive stela of black basalt, the laws of Hammurabi were displayed publicly, a visible statement of royal authority. At the top of the stela, the king is depicted standing before Shamash, receiving the rod and ring of authority. The symbolism was clear. Justice came from the gods, but it was administered through Hammurabi. The king was both servant and agent of divine order. The code itself contained nearly 300 provisions covering a vast array of issues: property rights, trade agreements, family matters, inheritance, wages, injuries, theft, and even medical malpractice. It was in essence a portrait of Mesopotamian society carved into stone. Farmers, merchants, artisans, priests, soldiers, slaves, and nobles all appeared in its clauses, each bound by specific duties and protected or limited by specific rights. Perhaps the most famous principle of the code was retribution. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If he breaks another's bone, they shall break his bone. This notion of exact retaliation, known as lex talionis, expressed the belief that justice was balance, that harm should be repaid in kind. But the code was not uniform. Punishments varied according to social status. If a noble injured another noble, retaliation was equal. If a noble injured a commoner, he paid a fine. If a noble injured a slave, the penalty was lighter still. Justice in Hammurabi's world was not blind. It was stratified, reflecting the rigid hierarchy of Mesopotamian society. The code also reveals concern for vulnerable groups. Widows and orphans were given special protection, their rights to property and inheritance safeguarded. Tenants and sharecroppers were shielded from total ruin if crops failed due to flood or storm. Debts could be forgiven in extraordinary circumstances, preventing families from collapsing into slavery. While the law reinforced inequality, it also acknowledged the fragility of life in a land where disaster was never far away. Commerce was heavily regulated. Merchants who cheated customers faced severe penalties. Interest rates were set, contracts enforced, partnerships recognized. Physicians were held accountable for their treatments. If a doctor's surgery killed a noble, his hands could be cut off. Builders whose houses collapsed and killed occupants faced execution. These laws reflected the practical realities of an urban society where trust had to extend beyond personal relationships. Written law created predictability, stability, and confidence in trade and labor. Family life, too, was codified. Marriage was treated as a contract, with dowries and bride prices carefully defined. Adultery carried harsh punishments, though the severity often fell more heavily on women. Divorce was permitted under specific circumstances, with protections for wives to ensure they were not cast aside without provision. Inheritance laws detailed how property was divided among sons, daughters, and adopted children. Through these regulations, the code sought to preserve the household as the basic unit of society, ensuring continuity across generations. What makes Hammurabi's code remarkable is not that it was the first. Earlier codes like that of Ur-Nammu had already existed, but that it was comprehensive, publicly displayed, and infused with divine authority. It was less a legal manual in the modern sense than a monument, a statement of how justice should be conceived, of how power and fairness were intertwined. By carving it into stone and placing it where all could see, Hammurabi declared that law was not hidden in palace archives, but open, permanent, and universal within his realm. Hammurabi's reign lasted more than 40 years, and during that time, Babylon flourished. Canals were dug and maintained, linking farmlands to rivers. temples were built and restored, drawing pilgrims and priests. Trade routes extended outward, bringing wealth from distant lands. The city itself expanded, its streets crowded with merchants, artisans, priests, and scribes. Babylon was no longer a provincial town. It was the heart of a kingdom, a center of culture, law, and power. But as with all Mesopotamian empires, the brilliance was fragile. After Hammurabi's death, his successors struggled to maintain the unity he had forged. Rivals pressed in from the north and east. The Kassites, a people from the Zagros highlands, would eventually take Babylon and rule for centuries. The empire Hammurabi built did not long outlive him, and yet his legacy endured. His laws were copied, studied, and adapted. His model of kingship, blending conquest with justice, became the standard for later rulers. And Babylon, though it would rise and fall many times, remained fixed in the imagination of the ancient world as a city of destiny. The story of Hammurabi is the story of how power and justice fused in the ancient world. He was a conqueror, yes, but he was remembered not for battles alone, but for carving law into stone. His code, imperfect and unequal though it was, represented humanity's attempt to bind society with rules, rather than whims, to make justice something visible and enduring. In the shadow of his stela, civilization took another great step forward, one whose echoes still shape the laws and ideas of our own world. Assyria, the rise of a warrior state. In the centuries after Hammurabi's reign, the spotlight of Mesopotamia shifted. Babylon endured, battered by Kassites, Elamites, and shifting powers. But further north, along the upper Tigris, another city was gathering strength. This city was Assur, and from its walls grew a tradition unlike anything Mesopotamia had yet seen, where the southern cities defined themselves by temples, trade, and codes of law. Assur and its successors would define themselves by war. From modest beginnings, the Assyrians forged a reputation so fearsome that their very name would one day evoke dread. They were farmers and traders, but above all, they became warriors, and through the power of iron, organization, and terror, they carved out one of the most formidable empires the ancient world had known. The roots of Assyria lay in trade. Long before its armies marched, merchants from Assur sent caravans westward into Anatolia, establishing colonies such as Kanesh. There they traded tin and textiles from Mesopotamia for silver and goods of the highlands. Clay tablets from these colonies reveal contracts, partnerships, and the daily risks of commerce. These merchants were not simple wanderers, but organized networks backed by the city's institutions. Through trade, Assyria built wealth, connections, and a spirit of expansion. But in the world of Mesopotamia, wealth always drew the gaze of ambition, and ambition demanded defense. Out of commerce grew militarization. Assyria's geography encouraged both toughness and opportunity. Unlike the flat alluvium of the south, the northern plain was edged by mountains and river valleys, exposed to raids from highland tribes and nomadic peoples. To survive here, discipline was essential. Fields needed defending, caravans protecting, walls manned against incursions. This constant pressure hardened Assyria. Its kings presented themselves as shepherds, but they were armed shepherds, ready to strike wolves before they struck the flock. Over centuries, this mindset crystallized into a defining feature: Assyria, as a state whose very identity rested on military strength. The Assyrians worshipped their chief god, Ashur, with a fervor that blended religion and conquest into one. Unlike the many god pantheons of Sumer and Babylon, where each city had its patron deity among equals, the god Ashur was both local and supreme. He was not just a city god, but the embodiment of the state itself. To expand Assyria was to expand the domain of Ashur. To conquer was to fulfill divine will. Kings presented their campaigns not as personal ambition, but as holy wars carried out for the honor of their god. This fusion of faith and militarism gave the Assyrian kings unyielding justification for endless expansion. The earliest Assyrian kings were modest rulers, their titles still humble. They oversaw a small city-state, more concerned with trade routes than conquest. But as centuries passed, pressures mounted from rivals in Babylonia, the Mitanni, and the Hittites. Assyria's leaders began to turn outward aggressively. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, they had forged a kingdom that rivaled Babylon, and from that foundation, the great empire of Assyria was born. The transformation of Assyria into a superpower unfolded over several centuries, but its character remained consistent. Ruthless efficiency in war, relentless pursuit of expansion, and the use of terror as a tool of statecraft. Assyrian kings marched armies farther than their predecessors, striking not only at neighboring cities, but at entire regions. Campaigns were launched annually, almost ritually, with the expectation that kings would return with plunder, captives, and tribute. Failure to campaign was seen as weakness, a betrayal of duty to God and people alike. The Assyrian military machine was unlike anything the world had seen. While earlier armies relied heavily on temporary levies, the Assyrians created one of the first standing armies. Professional soldiers maintained year-round. They mastered the use of iron weapons, giving their troops an advantage over bronze-armed foes. Chariots thundered across plains. Cavalry units developed to harry enemies, and siege warfare became a terrifying art. Battering rams, towers, sappers who tunneled beneath walls. These became hallmarks of Assyrian campaigns. Their brutality was legendary. Inscriptions boast of enemies flayed alive, cities burned, captives impaled on stakes. Such acts were not random cruelty, but deliberate policy designed to terrify would-be rebels into submission before resistance could even begin. This reputation was broadcast through monumental art. Carved reliefs from palaces depict endless scenes of conquest, archers loosing volleys, soldiers scaling ladders, kings driving chariots over fleeing enemies. One famous series shows the siege of Lachish, a Judean city conquered by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The carvings detail every stage: battering rams breaching walls, defenders impaled, captives led away in chains, treasure carried to the king. These were not hidden in palace halls, but displayed prominently, reminders to every visitor of Assyrian might. Art was propaganda, reinforcing the inevitability of Assyrian dominance. But the empire was not built on terror alone. The Assyrians developed advanced systems of governance to hold their vast realm together. Conquered lands were incorporated through provincial administration. Governors appointed directly by the king oversaw taxation, law, and security. A network of roads and relay stations allowed messages to travel rapidly, ensuring that royal decrees reached distant provinces in days rather than weeks. Deportations became another tool of control. Populations from rebellious regions were uprooted and resettled elsewhere in the empire, breaking local ties but enriching Assyrian cities with new labor and skills. In this way, the empire grew not only through conquest, but through deliberate integration. Religion sanctified every aspect of this system. Kings were not merely rulers, but high priests of Ashur, his chosen agents on earth. Campaigns were framed as religious obligations. Victories were celebrated with sacrifices, defeats interpreted as divine displeasure. The blending of faith and politics meant that resistance was not only rebellion against Assyria, but blasphemy against Ashur himself. The king's titles reflected this fusion: King of the universe, King of the four quarters of the world. Such claims were not modest. They proclaimed Assyria's rule as cosmic destiny. The cultural achievements of Assyria were significant, even if overshadowed by their militarism. In Nineveh and other capitals, libraries were assembled, filled with clay tablets copied from across Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, prided himself on literacy, boasting that he could read Sumerian and Akkadian texts himself without a scribe. His library contained myths, hymns, omens, medical texts, and histories, a treasure trove of ancient knowledge preserved through his passion. Ironically, the very state known for terror became one of history's greatest archivists, ensuring that the literature of Mesopotamia survived to be rediscovered thousands of years later. Daily life in Assyria blended the harshness of its politics with the rhythms familiar across Mesopotamia. Farmers worked fields of barley and wheat, irrigated by canals. Shepherds tended flocks of sheep and goats. Artisans produced textiles, pottery, and metalwork. Women played roles in household and temple economies, though under patriarchal structures reinforced by law. Merchants still traveled, though now under the protection and taxation of Assyrian authority. Beneath the shadow of empire, ordinary life continued, marked by toil, devotion, and small joys. But the weight of empire bore heavily. Assyria's relentless campaigns drained resources, demanded constant labor, and spread exhaustion across its territories. Tribute flowed into the capital cities, Kala, Dur-Sharukin, Nineveh, funding monumental palaces and temples. The wealth dazzled, but it was extracted from conquered peoples who often seethed with resentment. The cycle of conquest bred both glory and fragility. For while terror could silence opposition, it could not eliminate the hatred that smoldered beneath. The Assyrian Empire reached its peak in the 7th century BCE, stretching from Egypt to Persia, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. It was by every measure the greatest power the ancient Near East had yet seen. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon expanded and maintained this colossal domain with ruthless efficiency. But as with every Mesopotamian empire, the seeds of collapse lay within its triumphs. The constant need for expansion created overextension. Revolts flared despite terror. The cost of armies and palaces strained resources. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others rose against Assyria. They marched on Nineveh, the jewel of the empire, and stormed its walls. The great city burned. Its palaces toppled, its libraries buried in ash. The Assyrian Empire vanished with shocking speed, its terror extinguished, its dominance undone. But the memory endured for centuries after. Assyria's name remained a byword for cruelty, its kings remembered as scourges of nations. At the same time, its innovations in warfare, governance, and culture left lasting marks. The rise of Assyria was a story of discipline forged in hardship, of a god whose will became synonymous with conquest, of kings who turned war into an institution. It was a story of brilliance and brutality intertwined, of libraries and executions, of order enforced by fear. In the long saga of Mesopotamia, Assyria stood apart, a warrior state whose ambition was boundless, whose power reshaped the ancient Near East, and whose fall reminded all that even the mightiest empire cannot outlast the turning of time. The Neo-Babylonian Empire and the glory of Nebuchadnezzar II. When the fire consumed Nineveh in 612 BCE and the Assyrian war machine finally collapsed, the power that had terrified nations for centuries dissolved into dust. The vacuum left behind was immense. The land between the rivers, once drilled under the iron hand of Ashur's kings, was open to conquest, open to dreams of restoration. Into this moment stepped Babylon, a city that had long lingered in the shadow of empires. Once raised to glory by Hammurabi, it had endured centuries of foreign rule, Kassites, Assyrians, and countless rivals. But Babylon had never been erased. Its ziggurat still loomed above the plain. Its priests still tended Marduk's shrine. Its memory still carried weight. And now, with Assyria fallen, Babylon rose again. The Babylonians did not act alone. The coalition that brought down Nineveh was forged between Babylonian princes, the Medes from the Iranian plateau, and other allies who had suffered under Assyrian rule. In the ruins of Assyria, they divided spoils, carving up provinces, reassigning power. Babylon, under Nabopolassar, claimed the lion's share of Mesopotamia. His campaigns restored southern lands and established Babylon as the center of a new order. This was the birth of what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a revival not only of political control, but of cultural pride, a deliberate attempt to reclaim Babylon's ancient mantle as the heart of civilization. The most famous ruler of this new dynasty was Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE. His name is remembered in chronicles, in scriptures, and in ruins. To his subjects, he was the restorer of Babylon's glory. To conquered peoples, he was a conqueror whose power could not be denied. His reign lasted more than 4 decades, a span that allowed him to consolidate the empire, expand its borders, and rebuild his capital into one of the most dazzling cities the world had ever seen. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns extended Babylonian power across the Near East. He defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish in 605 BCE, securing control of Syria and the Levant. He pressed into Phoenician cities, demanding tribute from Tyre and Sidon. Most famously, he turned his armies against the kingdom of Judah, besieging Jerusalem not once, but twice. In 597 BCE, he captured the city, deporting its king Jehoiakim and thousands of elites to Babylon. A decade later, after rebellion flared again, he returned with overwhelming force. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem's walls were torn down, its temple burned, its treasures carried off. Thousands were marched into exile, beginning the Babylonian captivity that would shape Jewish history and theology for generations. To Nebuchadnezzar, these conquests were acts of necessity and destiny. To control the Levant was to secure trade routes and buffer zones. To crush rebellion was to uphold divine order. But to those who suffered, his name became synonymous with destruction. In Hebrew scriptures, he is remembered as the king who humbled Jerusalem, an instrument of divine judgment, but also of grief. For Babylon, however, his victories filled treasuries, enriched temples, and confirmed the city's supremacy. The wealth of conquest flowed into Babylon itself, and Nebuchadnezzar turned it into a stage for grandeur. He rebuilt temples, restored canals, and expanded fortifications. The city's walls became legendary, described as so wide that chariots could race upon them. The Ishtar Gate, constructed of glazed blue bricks, adorned with images of lions, bulls, and dragons, rose as a ceremonial entrance to the city. Its brilliance stunned visitors, a gateway not only of stone, but of myth, where Marduk's protection was displayed in color and form. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, a broad avenue used during festivals, lined with reliefs and inscriptions that proclaimed Babylon's divine favor. At the heart of the city rose the great ziggurat, known to later tradition as the Tower of Babel, dedicated to Marduk. It soared into the sky, a stepped mountain of baked brick that connected heaven and earth. Priests ascended its heights to perform rituals, to honor the god who was the city's patron and protector. Around it clustered temples, palaces, and administrative buildings, forming a sacred and political core. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions boast that he rebuilt the Temple of Marduk, returning it to splendor and reaffirming Babylon's role as the center of the cosmos. Legends grew around the city's wonders. Ancient writers spoke of the Hanging Gardens, a marvel of terraced greenery irrigated by ingenious systems, said to have been built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen, who longed for her mountainous homeland. Whether these gardens truly existed or were later imagination remains debated, but the story itself reflects the image of Babylon as a city of miracles, where human ambition and divine favor created marvels beyond ordinary measure. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not only about conquest and construction, but about order. He maintained a strong administrative system, appointing governors, collecting tribute, and ensuring canals and fields were managed. Agriculture flourished under his oversight, feeding the vast population and sustaining trade. Merchants thrived, carrying Babylonian goods to distant lands and bringing back treasures from as far as India and Arabia. The empire was both a military power and an economic hub, its influence radiating across the Near East. Religion permeated this order. Nebuchadnezzar styled himself as Marduk's chosen, the one who restored the gods' temples, who maintained justice, who subdued enemies in the divine name. The New Year festival, central to Babylonian religion, was celebrated with extraordinary pomp under his reign. During it, the statue of Marduk was carried through the city, and the king underwent rituals of humility, confessing his unworthiness and being reaffirmed as chosen. In this drama, Nebuchadnezzar's rule was woven directly into cosmic stability, his authority sanctified by ritual performance. Despite his achievements, Nebuchadnezzar's empire was not eternal. After his death, successors struggled to maintain the balance he had built. Intrigue and weak leadership weakened the dynasty. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia marched into Babylon, and the city fell without battle. The Persian conquest marked the end of Babylon's independence, but not its memory. For centuries, the image of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon remained vivid, a city of towering walls, dazzling gates, and unstoppable armies. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was brief, barely a century, but its impact was immense. It restored Babylon's place at the center of Mesopotamia, reaffirmed its cultural pride, and etched its wonders into the imagination of later ages. In biblical texts, it became a symbol of exile and hubris, of human pride reaching to heaven only to be humbled. In Greek accounts, it became a city of marvels and mysteries. In modern archaeology, its ruins still speak of ambition, artistry, and power. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy is complex. He was a builder who left behind some of the most stunning monuments of the ancient world, but also a conqueror remembered for destruction. He was a patron of religion who honored Marduk, but also a figure cast as oppressor in the traditions of others. He embodied the dual nature of empire itself, capable of greatness and cruelty, of beauty and devastation. In the long history of Mesopotamia, the Neo-Babylonian period was one final blaze of brilliance before the land passed into new hands. The Persians would rule, then the Greeks, then the Parthians and Romans, but none erased the memory of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. It became an archetype, a city that lived on not only in ruins but in myth, a name that echoed far beyond the Euphrates, carrying both wonder and warning. Persia and the fall of Babylon. The brilliance of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon cast a long shadow, but shadows always lengthened toward decline. After the great king's death in 562 BCE, the empire he had forged began to weaken. His successors lacked his authority and vision, and within a generation, Babylon's strength frayed. The monuments remained. The walls stood tall, the ziggurat still rose into the heavens. But behind the facade, the empire was unraveling. Into this moment of fragility came a force from beyond Mesopotamia, a rising power from the Iranian plateau, whose ambitions extended farther than any king of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, or Babylon had ever dared. This was Persia, and under Cyrus the Great, it would bring Babylon to its knees, not with fire and ruin, but with a strategy and a vision that transformed the ancient world. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, after Nebuchadnezzar, passed to his son, Amel-Marduk. Remembered in later traditions as weak and incapable, he ruled only 2 years before being assassinated. His successor, Neriglissar, managed some stability, but reigned briefly. Then came Labashi-Marduk, a boy king whose time on the throne ended in conspiracy. Finally, Nabonidus seized power, a ruler who would lead Babylon into its final act. Nabonidus was a peculiar figure among Mesopotamian kings. While most rulers presented themselves as devout servants of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, Nabonidus elevated the moon god Sin to unusual prominence. He restored temples to Sin, invoked him in inscriptions, and even spent long years away from Babylon in the oasis of Timah in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern in his absence. To the Babylonian priesthood and many citizens, this neglect of Marduk was nothing less than sacrilege. As Babylon wrestled with religious discontent and political instability, Persia was rising under the leadership of Cyrus II. Known to history as Cyrus the Great, he began as a vassal king of Anshan, a small Persian state under Median rule. Through cunning and force, he overthrew his Median overlords and united the Persian tribes with the Medes. This union created a powerful new kingdom on Mesopotamia's eastern frontier. From there, Cyrus expanded relentlessly. He conquered Lydia in Anatolia, defeating the wealthy king Croesus. He extended his control over vast territories, building a reputation not only for military genius, but for tolerance and statesmanship.
Where Assyrian kings had ruled by terror, Cyrus ruled by diplomacy and respect, integrating conquered peoples into his empire rather than annihilating them. By the 540s BCE, Cyrus turned his gaze toward Babylon. The city was still formidable. Its walls were said to stretch for miles, thick and high, impossible to breach. Its temples glittered with wealth. Its traditions gave it prestige. But inside, Babylon was divided. Nabonidus's devotion to sin had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk. Economic pressures and heavy taxation burdened the people. Political alliances had frayed. Cyrus saw not only a city, but an opportunity. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched on Babylon. The armies met at Opis near the Tigris. Babylonian forces were crushed. Soon after, Sippar surrendered without resistance. The way to Babylon lay open. According to accounts, Cyrus's troops entered the city without battle. Some traditions say they diverted the Euphrates River, lowering its waters so soldiers could march along the riverbed under the walls. Others suggest the gates were opened from within, perhaps by conspirators sympathetic to Cyrus or hostile to Nabonidus. However it happened, the result was the same. Babylon, the great city of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, fell swiftly. The entry of Cyrus into Babylon was unlike the sackings of Assyrian conquest. There was no mass slaughter, no burning of temples, no flaying of kings. Instead, Cyrus presented himself as a liberator. In the famous Cyrus Cylinder, a clay inscription often hailed as an early charter of human rights, Cyrus declared that Marduk himself had chosen him to restore justice and order to Babylon. He denounced Nabonidus for neglecting the god, and promised to honor Marduk's temple to protect the city, to allow displaced peoples to return to their homelands. This message resonated. The priesthood welcomed him. The people, weary of misrule, accepted him. Babylon had fallen, but it had not been destroyed. One of Cyrus's most remarkable acts was his policy toward the exiles taken by Nebuchadnezzar. Among them were the Judeans, whose temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, whose leaders had been carried to Babylon in chains. Cyrus allowed them to return to their homeland, to rebuild their temple, to restore their traditions. To the Jews, this act was seen as divine deliverance. In the Hebrew scriptures, Cyrus is called the Lord's Anointed, a foreign king celebrated as an instrument of God's will. Through such policies, Cyrus wove together an empire that was not merely imposed by force, but bound by cooperation and legitimacy. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE was more than the end of a dynasty. It was the end of Mesopotamian independence, the close of a chapter that had lasted for thousands of years. For 3 millennia, the land between the rivers had produced the first cities, the first writing, the first laws, the first empires. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, each had risen and fallen, but always within the frame of Mesopotamian culture. Now that frame itself was absorbed into something larger. Persia did not erase Mesopotamia, but it subordinated it to an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. The center of gravity shifted. Babylon remained a jewel, but it was no longer the beating heart of the world. Under Persian rule, Babylon retained importance. Cyrus and his successors respected its temples, employed its scribes, maintained its canals. Festivals continued. Priests still tended Marduk.
Markets still thrived, but decisions that shaped the destiny of nations were now made not in Babylon alone, but in Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana. The unique rhythm of Mesopotamian independence, the cycle of city-states and empires rising and falling, was broken. The rivers still flowed, but their political course had been joined to a wider ocean. The symbolism of Babylon's fall resonated deeply. To Mesopotamians, it was both tragedy and transformation. To later peoples, it became myth. In biblical tradition, Babylon came to symbolize arrogance, exile, and downfall. To Greek historians, it became a marvel of wealth and architecture. To modern archaeologists, its ruins reveal both grandeur and fragility. The event of 539 BCE marked a hinge in history, when one of humanity's oldest centers of power yielded to a new vision of empire. Cyrus the Great died in 530 BCE, but the empire he founded endured. His successors expanded it, turning Persia into the largest empire the world had ever seen. Babylon remained a jewel within it, sometimes rebelling, sometimes flourishing, but never again ruling independently. Its monuments endured for centuries, until time, neglect, and conquest reduced them to ruin. But its memory never faded. To speak of Babylon became to speak of majesty and fall, of greatness and pride, of a city that had once stood at the center of the human story. The fall of Babylon to Persia did not erase Mesopotamian civilization, but it marked its transformation. The inventions of Sumer, the ambition of Akkad, the justice of Hammurabi, the terror of Assyria, the grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar, all were now threads in a larger tapestry. Persia inherited them, absorbed them, carried them forward. In that inheritance lay continuity, but also the end of Mesopotamia as an independent force. The rivers that had birthed civilization now flowed under new rulers, their waters carrying the echoes of a world that had given humanity its first cities, its first laws, its first empires. The legacy of Mesopotamia. When the banners of Cyrus unfurled above Babylon's towering walls, the independent story of Mesopotamia drew to its close. But the fall of Babylon was not the eraser of what had come before. It was a transformation. For 3,000 years, the peoples of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria had built a foundation so deep and so wide that even conquest could not sweep it away. The Persians absorbed Mesopotamia into their empire, but in doing so, they inherited a legacy that would continue to shape the world long after the voices of the original builders were silenced. The first element of that legacy was the city itself. Mesopotamia had pioneered the very concept of urban life. From the clustered huts of Eridu to the sprawling neighborhoods of Uruk, humans had learned to live together in numbers never before seen. The experiment had been fragile, often violent, but it succeeded. It set patterns that every later civilization would follow: streets that channeled movement, walls that defined community, temples at the center, palaces looming above, markets alive with trade. The organization of space was more than practical. It was symbolic. Each city was a microcosm of the universe, a place where humans could negotiate their relationship with the divine, with each other, and with the unpredictable forces of nature. This urban model endured. The Persians, though masters of empire, built capitals that echoed Mesopotamian design. The Greeks, when they raised their poleis, drew unconsciously from principles that had been worked out in the mud-brick lanes of Uruk. The Romans, with their forums and aqueducts, with their sprawling administrative centers, carried forward an inheritance they scarcely recognized. Even today, when we think of what a city is, a dense place of specialization, of government, of religion, of culture, we are thinking along paths first carved by the inhabitants of Mesopotamia. The second great legacy was writing. On clay tablets pressed with reeds, the Sumerians discovered how to capture speech, how to make thought permanent. What began as a tool of merchants and priests evolved into something far greater. Cuneiform became not only an instrument of record-keeping, but a medium for literature, law, science, and myth. From those wedge-shaped signs came epics that spoke of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. They left us the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's earliest masterpieces, a story of a king who sought immortality and learned instead the necessity of death. They left hymns to gods, laments for destroyed cities, proverbs of daily wisdom. They left contracts, letters, inventories, and mathematical calculations.
When Persia took Babylon, scribes still trained in tablet houses, still mastered the 600 signs of Cuneiform, still copied ancient texts. But Cuneiform itself would not endure forever. By the 1st century of our era, it had vanished, replaced by alphabetic scripts far simpler to learn. Yet the idea it embodied, that human speech could be captured, stored, and transmitted, had become irreversible. Every alphabet, every scroll, every printed book, every glowing word on a digital screen descends from that Mesopotamian insight. When a student writes notes in a classroom, when a poet records a line in the dark of night, they are echoing the hand of a Sumerian scribe, pressing a stylus into clay. The third inheritance was law. In Mesopotamia, humans first confronted the problem of order in large societies. Kinship alone was not enough to regulate thousands of people living together. Custom had to be written, rules formalized. The law codes of Ur-Nammu, Lipit-Ishtar, and Hammurabi stand as milestones in human thought. They did not invent justice, but they gave it structure. They declared that wrongs could be compensated, that injuries could be redressed, that property had definition, that family relations had boundaries. Hammurabi's stela, with its carved relief of the king receiving authority from Shamash, still speaks across the centuries. It tells us that law should stand above personal whim, that even the king must appeal to divine authority when he pronounces judgment. The principle has endured.
Modern courts and parliaments operate in a very different world, but the concept that laws can be codified, that they can be published, that they can provide consistency, that began beside the Tigris and Euphrates. Every constitution, every book of statutes, every recorded precedent bears the distant imprint of Mesopotamian tablets. There was also the inheritance of science and mathematics. Out of practical needs, to measure fields, to calculate harvests, to mark the movements of the stars for calendars, Mesopotamians developed a system of numbers unlike any other. They chose 60 as their base, a choice that still governs our time and our geometry.
60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. All are echoes of scribal calculations, etched into clay 4,000 years ago. Their astronomers tracked the paths of Venus and Jupiter. Their physicians compiled diagnostic handbooks, linking symptoms to prognosis. Their surveyors marked out boundaries with cords and stakes. Their knowledge was intertwined with religion. An eclipse was an omen, as well as a celestial event. But beneath the ritual lay genuine observation and accumulation of data. In the libraries of Ashurbanipal, in the archives of Babylon, thousands of such tablets were preserved, later rediscovered by scholars who marveled at their precision. The Greeks, inheritors of Babylonian astronomy, would use this data as the seedbed for their own theories. From Mesopotamian priests watching the night sky on temple platforms came the intellectual ancestry of Ptolemy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton. There was the inheritance of empire. Mesopotamia had pioneered the idea that diverse peoples could be drawn together under a single authority. Sargon of Akkad had shown how city-states could be broken and reassembled into a greater whole. The Assyrians had carried the concept to its most ruthless extreme, ruling through fear and deportation. The Babylonians had refined it with spectacle and architecture. When Persia rose, it took these lessons and reshaped them.
Cyrus built a model of empire not only on conquest but on respect, a system of satrapies and governors, of roads and postal relays, of tolerance for local gods and customs. But this system did not arise from nowhere. It grew from the long Mesopotamian experiment in organizing human diversity, in balancing center and periphery, in managing tribute and rebellion. Rome, Byzantium, the Caliphates, the Ottomans, and even modern states inherited these patterns. Every empire that seeks to hold together peoples of different language, faith, and culture walks in Mesopotamian footsteps. And then there was religion. The pantheon of Mesopotamia, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Shamash, Ishtar, Marduk, may no longer be worshipped, but their stories reverberated. The flood of Utnapishtim echoes in Noah's Ark. The descent of Inanna foreshadows Persephone's journey to Hades. The lament for destroyed cities anticipates biblical prophets mourning Jerusalem. The theology of order versus chaos, of divine judgment, of cosmic struggle, seeded ideas that spread far beyond Mesopotamia's plains. Through the Hebrews, who lived in exile along the canals of Babylon, and through the Persians who absorbed Mesopotamian concepts into Zoroastrian dualism, threads of Mesopotamian thought entered Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Even today, when people speak of towers of pride, of writing on the wall, of Babylon as a symbol of corruption, they are invoking memories first shaped in that ancient land. The legacy was not only in grand ideas, it was in the texture of daily life. The bread baked in Mesopotamian ovens, the beer brewed from barley, the textiles woven on looms, the bricks fired in kilns. These technologies spread and endured. Agricultural practices, irrigation canals, the use of draft animals, the design of plows, all were refined in the alluvium of the Tigris and Euphrates, and then carried outward by trade and conquest. Even the word civilization, from the Latin for city, reflects a concept first tested in Mesopotamian towns. When Persia took Babylon, it ensured continuity. Temples were repaired. Scribes continued their work. Farmers still plowed the fields. But slowly, the distinct Mesopotamian identity blurred. The Persians brought their own gods, their own language, their own traditions. The Greeks, after Alexander, layered theirs atop what remained. The Parthians, the Romans, the Sasanians, and finally the Arabs, each left their mark. Cuneiform faded. Ziggurats crumbled. The old gods were forgotten, and yet beneath every new layer, the foundations remained. Archaeologists in the 19th century, when they uncovered tablets and translated cuneiform for the first time, were astonished. They realized that the stories, laws, and calculations of Mesopotamia had not been lost, but only buried. The spade brought them back to light, revealing that much of what humanity considered uniquely Greek or biblical had deeper roots. The recognition was humbling. Civilization had not begun with Athens or Rome. It had begun millennia earlier, between two rivers, in the mud and reeds of a land that had once seemed forgotten. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not just a list of inventions. It is the reminder that human societies are cumulative. Each generation inherits the achievements of the past, adapts them, transforms them, and passes them forward. The Mesopotamians themselves borrowed from earlier foragers, from Anatolia, from Iran, from the Levant. Later peoples borrowed from them. Civilization is not a straight line but a web, and Mesopotamia was one of its greatest nodes. Even in decline, the land retained symbolic power. To Jews exiled there, Babylon was both a place of despair and a stage for renewal. To Greeks, it was a wonder of the world, a city of walls and gardens, of wealth beyond imagining. To later religions, it became a symbol of pride and sin, of human ambition punished. To modern culture, it is shorthand for decadence, for lost grandeur, for ancient beginnings. Babylon lives on, not only in ruins but in metaphor. When we trace the story from the first farmers gathering wild barley to the conquest by Cyrus, we see not only the rise and fall of states, but the evolution of humanity itself. The Mesopotamians did not know they were inventing civilization. They were simply responding to the needs of survival, to feed their children, to appease their gods, to defend their homes. But in their responses, they created patterns that endure. We, their distant descendants, still live within those patterns. We still gather in cities, still write our words, still obey our laws, still look to the heavens for guidance, still build states that rise and fall. The clay tablets may crumble, but the ideas they carried remain. The rivers of Mesopotamia no longer dominate global power, but their legacy flows through every human institution. To speak of civilization without speaking of Mesopotamia is to forget our own beginning. In the hum of traffic in a modern city, in the turning of a page, in the tick of a clock, in the judgment of a court, in the orbit of a planet calculated by astronomers, Mesopotamia still whispers. Its legacy is not past, it is present, woven invisibly into the fabric of human life. The Hellenistic transformation, when the armies of Alexander the Great thundered into Mesopotamia in the 4th century BCE, the world between the rivers had already been folded into the fabric of Persia for 200 years. Under the Achaemenid kings, Babylon and its neighbors had lived in a state of cautious continuity. Temples were maintained, scribes still inscribed their tablets, farmers tended their fields, merchants traded along roads watched over by Persian satraps. Yet the center of gravity had shifted eastward to Persepolis and Susa, and Babylon was no longer the unquestioned heart of empire. For generations it endured in that role of provincial magnificence, a city still awe-inspiring, still ancient, but no longer sovereign. Then in 331 BCE, the old order collapsed in the dust of battle. At Gaugamela, on the plains of northern Mesopotamia, Alexander of Macedon faced Darius III of Persia. The clash was decisive. Darius brought with him the weight of the greatest empire yet known, chariots with scythed blades, lines of Persian infantry, cavalry stretching across the horizon. Alexander brought fewer men, but an army hardened by years of conquest in Greece and Asia Minor, drilled to perfection and led by a general of unmatched daring. The phalanxes pressed forward. The companion cavalry struck like a thunderbolt, and the Persian lines broke. Darius fled, his empire shattered. Mesopotamia, the land of rivers, became part of Alexander's vision of a world united under one rule. When Alexander marched into Babylon, the gates opened. There was no resistance, no fiery sack. The citizens greeted him with offerings. The priests led processions. The city acclaimed him as king. To them, Alexander was not only a conqueror, but a liberator from Persian dominance. He entered the city with respect, participating in its ancient rituals, sacrificing to Marduk, honoring traditions that had endured for millennia. The Macedonian conqueror understood the power of symbols. To rule Mesopotamia, one had to become part of its story, to stand in the line of kings stretching back to Sargon, Hammurabi, and Nebuchadnezzar. For Alexander, Babylon was more than a prize. It was a vision of empire's possibilities. Here was a city older than Greece itself, filled with monuments that dwarfed anything in Macedonia. Its walls still impressed even hardened veterans. Its ziggurat still towered over the plains. Its canals still fed fertile fields. The wealth of temples and palaces overflowed with offerings from centuries. To make Babylon his capital was to claim continuity with all that had come before. In this city, Alexander saw the potential for a new center of his world, not a Greek polis, not a Persian satrapy, but something larger, a place where East and West might meet. His plans were grand. He ordered the restoration of the great ziggurat, believed by later generations to be the Tower of Babel. He envisioned Babylon as the hub of administration, trade, and culture for a vast empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India. He discussed projects to improve irrigation, to expand harbors, to make the city once again the beating heart of civilization. Babylon, which had seen so many rulers come and go, seemed poised for a renaissance under its most famous conqueror. But Alexander's dreams ended as suddenly as they began. In 323 BCE, at the age of only 32, he fell ill in Babylon's palace after a banquet. Within days, the conqueror who had crossed continents was dead. The cause remains debated: fever, poisoning, exhaustion. But the result was certain.
Without Alexander's commanding presence, his empire fractured almost immediately. His generals, the Diadochi, carved it into pieces. Babylon became a prize contested among them, and in the chaos, its chance to reclaim centrality was lost. In the settlement of power that followed, Mesopotamia fell to Seleucus, one of Alexander's most able commanders. Seleucus founded a new dynasty, the Seleucids, and with it, a new vision for the region. He built a capital not at Babylon, but at Seleucia, on the Tigris, a city laid out in Greek style, with wide streets in a grid, theaters, gymnasiums, and administrative quarters. The decision was deliberate. Babylon was ancient, laden with traditions and priesthoods that might resist change. Seleucia was fresh, a canvas upon which Hellenistic culture could be painted without interference. Within a century, much of Babylon's population relocated to this new metropolis, drawn by its opportunities, its markets, and the favor of its rulers. The old city began its long decline, yet Babylon did not vanish overnight. Its temples remained active, its priests continued their rituals, its scribes copied tablets. The Seleucids, though Greek in culture, respected the prestige of Babylon's traditions. Kings came to the city for coronation ceremonies, acknowledging that legitimacy in Mesopotamia still flowed through its ancient deities. Documents from the time reveal an uneasy coexistence, Greek officials administering laws and taxes, Babylonian priests maintaining cult and calendar. Cuneiform continued to be written, though increasingly for religious and astronomical texts, while Greek became the language of administration. This fusion produced a cultural transformation. Mesopotamian astronomy, with its centuries of detailed observations, influenced Greek science. Priests who had charted the movements of Venus and Jupiter now shared knowledge with scholars, trained in the traditions of Aristotle and Plato. Greek philosophy, in turn, shaped how Babylonian scribes interpreted their own heritage. The result was an exchange that seeded developments in mathematics, astronomy, and cosmology for centuries to come. The very language of the zodiac, still used today, crystallized in this Hellenistic context. Religion, too, shifted. The old gods of Mesopotamia were identified with Greek counterparts: Marduk with Zeus, Ishtar with Aphrodite, Shamash with Apollo. In temples, rituals continued much as before, but syncretism blurred boundaries. Mystery cults and new philosophical schools spread through Seleucia, Uruk, and other cities, blending Greek and Eastern ideas. The Hellenistic world was cosmopolitan by nature, and Mesopotamia became one of its crossroads. A traveler in the 2nd century BCE might hear hymns to Marduk in one street, discussions of Stoic philosophy in another, and the chanting of Zoroastrian priests nearby. The land between the rivers was no longer a self-contained world, but part of a larger cultural network, stretching from the Nile to the Indus. Still, the decline of Babylon was visible. Clay tablets recording astronomical observations continue until the 1st century CE, but they grow fewer, their script increasingly archaic. By then, cuneiform had become a learned tradition maintained by a dwindling group of scribes. Greek writing, more flexible and widely taught, supplanted it. The ziggurats crumbled, neglected without royal patronage. Canals silted, fields turned to marsh. Travelers in later centuries described Babylon as a place of ruins, haunted by the ghosts of its former glory. The very name, Babylon, shifted in meaning from a living city to a symbol of lost grandeur, of pride punished, of civilizations that fall. The Seleucid dynasty itself weakened under pressure. The Parthians from the east, an Iranian people, rose in power and chipped away at Seleucid territories. By the 2nd century BCE, they had seized Mesopotamia. With their arrival, Greek influence remained, but the balance tilted once again toward Eastern traditions. Seleucia persisted, but new cities like Ctesiphon grew, eventually eclipsing it as centers of power. The Hellenistic transformation of Mesopotamia was not destruction, but layering. Greek culture did not erase Mesopotamian traditions. It intertwined with them. Astronomical tables, written in cuneiform,
informed Greek scientific texts. Babylonian deities merged with Olympians. Greek architectural forms appeared beside crumbling ziggurats. In daily life, people married across cultures, traded in markets where multiple languages were spoken, and lived in a world richer and more complex for its mingling. What had begun thousands of years earlier as scattered villages of mud brick had become by this time a cosmopolitan frontier of empires. The journey from Sumer to Seleucia was immense, but the thread was unbroken. The old river plain still fed harvests, still attracted rulers, still held symbolic weight. Yet the Mesopotamian world was no longer independent, no longer the initiator of civilization. It had become instead a contributor to a broader, globalized Hellenistic age. As the centuries passed, Babylon declined further until only fragments of its rituals survived. But its ideas lived on. Greek astronomers carried Mesopotamian observations to Alexandria. Philosophers absorbed its myths into allegories. Traders spread its agricultural techniques across new lands. Even as its monuments crumbled, the invisible legacy endured. The transformation brought by Alexander and his successors marked not the death of Mesopotamia, but its transmutation into something larger, a civilization woven into the fabric of the Hellenistic world, no longer the heart, but forever a foundation. The Parthian and Sasanian eras, as the Seleucid kings weakened under the weight of internal conflict and external invasion, the old land of Mesopotamia once again changed masters. The Hellenistic vision of Alexander had brought Greek language, art, and philosophy into the region, but it had also left behind cities drained of loyalty and empires too vast to govern. Into this vacuum rode a people from the Iranian plateau, skilled horsemen and archers, heirs to steppe traditions, and masters of survival in harsh landscapes. They were the Parthians, and with their rise, the fate of Mesopotamia shifted once more toward the east. The Parthians began as a small tribal confederation under the Arsacid dynasty, settled in the region of Parthia in northeastern Iran. From there, through relentless campaigns and opportunistic strikes, they seized territory from the Seleucids, exploiting their disunity. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, they controlled vast swaths of Iran and Mesopotamia, and in 141 BCE, they entered Babylon itself. The city, by then weary and diminished, offered little resistance. The Arsacid kings claimed the mantle of Mesopotamian rulers, presenting themselves as successors not to Alexander, but to Cyrus and Darius. This blending of Iranian tradition with Mesopotamian heritage became the hallmark of Parthian rule. The Parthians governed not with the centralizing hand of the Assyrians or the bureaucratic efficiency of the Persians, but through a looser system. Their empire was a confederation of semi-independent kings and local rulers, bound by loyalty to the Arsacid monarch in Mesopotamia. This meant that old cities like Babylon, Seleucia, and continued to function with relative autonomy. Temples were maintained, rituals performed, markets opened. The Parthian kings did not seek to erase the past, but to weave it into their legitimacy. They adopted royal titles echoing Achaemenid grandeur, and minted coins bearing Greek inscriptions and Hellenistic imagery, even as their court life and military style remained distinctly Iranian. Life in Mesopotamia under the Parthians was marked by continuity and slow change. Greek continued to be spoken in the cities, especially among elites and traders, while Aramaic spread as a common language across the countryside. Cuneiform writing, already declining under the Seleucids, dwindled further, with the last known astronomical tablets dating to the 1st century CE. The scribes who once filled libraries with thousands of clay records now dwindled to a handful of families preserving traditions, more out of devotion than practical use. The great intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia faded into obscurity, though not before passing fragments into Greek and later Islamic science. The Parthians were less concerned with irrigation and monumental construction than their predecessors, but they made Mesopotamia a vital crossroads of commerce. The Silk Road, connecting China to the Mediterranean, passed through their domains. Caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious stones from the east converged on Mesopotamian cities before continuing to Roman markets. Seleucia, rebuilt and thriving under Parthian patronage, became a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from India, Arabia, Persia, and Rome met. In its bazaars, one could hear a dozen languages, see coins of many kings, and find goods from every corner of the known world. Yet the Parthians were also defined by their rivalry with Rome. As the Roman Republic expanded eastward, it inevitably collided with Parthian power. In 53 BCE, at Carrhae in northern Mesopotamia, the Parthians inflicted one of Rome's greatest defeats. Crassus, the Roman triumvir, led legions deep into Mesopotamia, expecting quick victory. Instead, Parthian horse archers rained arrows from a distance, while heavily armored cataphracts charged with devastating effect. The Roman legions, unprepared for this style of warfare, were annihilated. Crassus himself was killed, his head allegedly sent to the Parthian king as a trophy. The battle cemented Parthia's reputation as Rome's equal, and Mesopotamia became the frontier where East and West tested their strength. For centuries, wars between Rome and Parthia surged across Mesopotamian plains. Cities were besieged, territories shifted hands, and populations endured the toll of invasion and reprisal. In this crucible, Mesopotamia once more played the role it had for millennia, the contested heartland between rival empires. Farmers rebuilt their fields after armies trampled them. Merchants adjusted trade routes. Priests prayed for stability. Rulers invoked ancient gods to sanctify their fragile authority. The land endured, as it always had, though the rulers changed. By the 3rd century CE, the Parthian Empire had grown stagnant. Its loose confederations struggled to manage vast lands. Its kings became embroiled in dynastic feuds, and local rulers asserted increasing autonomy. Out of Persia's southern province of Fars rose a new dynasty, claiming descent from the ancient Achaemenids and fueled by a revival of Zoroastrian religion. In 224 CE, Ardashir I defeated the last Parthian king and proclaimed the Sasanian Empire. With this change, Mesopotamia entered another era, one of centralization, grand architecture, and renewed ambition. The Sasanians ruled with a stronger hand than the Parthians. They established a centralized bureaucracy, enforced taxation, and elevated Zoroastrianism as the state religion. Mesopotamia became one of their core provinces, its fertile fields feeding armies, its cities serving as administrative and commercial centers. Ctesiphon, across the river from Seleucia, grew into a magnificent capital, filled with palaces and markets. Its most famous structure, the Tak Kasra Arch, still stands in ruins today, a testament to Sasanian architectural daring. Religion in Mesopotamia under the Sasanians was marked by both continuity and tension. Zoroastrian fire temples dotted the landscape, with priests enforcing orthodoxy and royal patronage. At the same time, Mesopotamia was home to a mosaic of faiths. Christianity, which spread rapidly from the 1st century onward. Judaism, which had deep roots since the Babylonian exile. Remnants of Mesopotamian paganism clinging to life in rural areas. And new movements, like Manichaeism, blending elements of Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist thought. The Sasanians alternately tolerated and persecuted these groups, depending on political needs. Christianity in particular flourished in Mesopotamia. From Edessa to Seleucia Ctesiphon, bishops organized congregations, monasteries rose, and theological schools trained scholars. The Church of the East, sometimes called the Nestorian Church, found in Mesopotamia a fertile ground, eventually sending missionaries as far as India and China. In this way, Mesopotamia became not just a receiver of religious traditions, but a transmitter, shaping the spiritual map of Eurasia. The Sasanian era also brought renewed conflict with Rome, now transformed into the Byzantine Empire. Mesopotamia was again the battleground, cities changing hands in brutal campaigns. In the 3rd century, The Roman Emperor Valerian was captured in battle by Shapur I and held prisoner in Mesopotamia, a humiliation carved into rock reliefs as propaganda for Sasanian power. Later centuries saw endless sieges, with cities like Nisibis and Dara fortified and refortified, their walls battered by Roman and Persian armies alike. Amid these wars, Mesopotamia continued its role as a prize and a crossroads. Trade along the Silk Road still passed through its cities.
Agricultural surplus continued to sustain armies and capitals. Intellectual life, while changed from its cuneiform past, thrived in new languages. Syriac for Christian scholars, Middle Persian for Zoroastrian priests, Greek for Byzantine refugees. The old gods were long gone, their temples abandoned or converted, but the land itself remained a center of human activity, adaptation, and survival. By the 6th and early 7th centuries, the wars between Byzantium and the Sasanians reached a fever pitch. Campaigns devastated Mesopotamian fields. Cities suffered repeated destruction, and populations were displaced. The final Great War between the two empires in the early 600s drained both to exhaustion. Heraclius of Byzantium struck deep into Persia, sacking cities and desecrating temples, while Khosrow II of Persia nearly conquered the Byzantine heartlands before his defeat. When the dust settled, both empires were shadows of their former strength, their resources spent, their legitimacy weakened. It was in this weakened state that a new power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Within decades of Muhammad's death, Arab-Muslim armies surged northward. In 637 CE, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, they defeated the Sasanian forces and soon after captured Ctesiphon. By 651, the last Sasanian king was dead, and Mesopotamia was incorporated into the expanding Islamic Caliphate. The rivers that had birthed civilization now flowed through a new world, one shaped by Arabic language, Islamic law, and the rise of Baghdad as a center of power. The Parthian and Sasanian centuries were a bridge between the Mesopotamia of ziggurats and cuneiform and the Mesopotamia of mosques and manuscripts. They preserved fragments of the old, layered them with Iranian and Hellenistic elements, and prepared the ground for the Islamic Golden Age. Though the gods of Sumer and Akkad were forgotten, though cuneiform lay buried in the earth, the land itself remained what it had always been, a crossroads, a stage upon which empires contended, a fertile plain where the destinies of peoples were written and rewritten. The coming of Islam and the birth of Baghdad. The fall of the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century CE marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the closing of an age. For centuries, Mesopotamia had been a battleground between Rome and Persia, a place where empires clashed until both were bled nearly dry. When the Arab armies surged northward from the Arabian Peninsula, they found not an impregnable foe, but a weakened land, weary of endless war, and disillusioned with rulers who could no longer provide security or prosperity. In the fields along the Euphrates and Tigris, in the markets of Ctesiphon, in the villages that clung to irrigation canals, the old world gave way to a new one. Islam had arrived, and with it began another chapter in the history of the land between rivers. The Arab forces, inspired by the unifying message of Islam and hardened by campaigns across the peninsula, struck first at the fringes of the Sasanian domains. In 636 CE, they met the Persian army at Al-Qadisiyah, a battle that would decide the fate of Mesopotamia. Despite the Sasanians' elephants, cavalry, and deep ranks, the cohesion of their army crumbled under pressure. The Arabs fought with discipline and determination, and after days of struggle, the Persian lines broke. The road to Ctesiphon lay open. When the Arabs entered the city, the jewel of the Sasanian kings, they found its palaces abandoned, its treasures left behind in haste. The famous Tak Kasra arch stood as a shell over a fallen empire. From that moment, Mesopotamia belonged to the expanding Islamic Caliphate. At first, it was ruled from Medina, and then Damascus under the Umayyads.
The new rulers encountered a land already rich in agriculture, scholarship, and urban life. They did not seek to destroy what existed, but to incorporate it. Taxes were levied, often building upon the structures left by Persians and Romans. Agricultural systems were maintained, canals cleared, markets supervised. The Arabic language slowly spread, not instantly replacing Aramaic, Syriac, or Middle Persian, but eventually becoming the dominant tongue of administration and culture. The conversion to Islam, too, was gradual. At first, many remained Jewish, Christian, or Zoroastrian, but over generations, the Islamic faith spread, especially as Arabic became the language of religion and law. It was under the Abbasid dynasty, beginning in 750 CE, that Mesopotamia regained a centrality it had not known since the days of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. The Abbasids, claiming descent from the Prophet's uncle, overthrew the Umayyads and shifted the heart of the Islamic world eastward. In 762 CE, the Caliph al-Mansur founded a new city on the banks of the Tigris, Baghdad. Its construction was deliberate, its symbolism immense. Baghdad was not a provincial capital, nor a military camp grown into a city. It was a planned seat of empire, designed to embody the unity of the Islamic world and the authority of its caliphs. The city was built in a circular plan, a form rarely seen before, with massive walls enclosing a perfect round shape, nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. At its center stood the caliph's palace and the great mosque, surrounded by administrative buildings and barracks. From this core, streets radiated outward like spokes, leading to gates that opened toward the provinces of the empire. It was both practical and symbolic. The world was ordered around the caliph, and all lands were connected to Baghdad. Contemporary observers marveled at its scale and design, calling it the City of Peace. Baghdad grew with astonishing speed. Within a generation, it became the largest city in the world, its population swelling with merchants, scholars, artisans, and laborers from across the empire. The markets bustled with goods from every direction, silks from China, spices from India, furs from the north, gold and ivory from Africa. Caravans arrived daily, unloading at warehouses, before traders haggled in bazaars. The Tigris carried boats laden with grain, dates, and wine. The air was filled with the sounds of sellers crying their wares, camels braying, coins clinking, and scholars debating in shaded courtyards. But Baghdad was more than a market. It was a beacon of knowledge. The Abbasids patronized learning on a scale that astonished the world. Caliphs gathered scholars of every background, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Persians, Greeks, and Indians, and supported their work in translation, philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. The House of Wisdom, established by Al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, became the most famous intellectual center of the medieval world. There, Greek philosophical texts were translated into Arabic. Indian treatises on mathematics and astronomy were studied, and Mesopotamian traditions of astrology and medicine were preserved and expanded. It was in Baghdad that algebra was developed as a formal discipline, its very name derived from the Arabic al-Jabr. Astronomers built observatories to track the heavens, inheriting the mantle of their Mesopotamian ancestors, who had once charted the stars from ziggurats. Physicians compiled encyclopedias, performing surgeries, studying anatomy, and preserving the works of Galen and Hippocrates. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, and Al-Razi transformed the knowledge of this ancient world into a foundation for new discoveries. The Abbasid caliphs themselves embraced this intellectual flowering, but it was not limited to elites. Baghdad's culture permeated daily life. Poets recited in coffeehouses and courtyards, weaving verses of love, satire, and philosophy. Storytellers preserved epics and fables, some of which were later gathered into the famous collection known as the 1001 Nights. Musicians played lutes and drums, blending Arab, Persian, and Greek traditions. Calligraphers adorned manuscripts with scripts so elegant that they were considered art in themselves. The wealth and brilliance of Baghdad dazzled visitors. From China came envoys of the Tang dynasty, marveling at the city's scale. From Europe, merchants and travelers spoke of its riches in hushed awe. To live in Baghdad was to live at the center of the world, in a place where knowledge, trade, and faith converged in dazzling abundance. And yet, as always in Mesopotamian history, greatness carried fragility. The Abbasid caliphs gradually lost direct control of their vast empire. Provinces grew autonomous. Military commanders asserted power, and rival dynasties carved away territory. By the 10th century, the caliph in Baghdad was often more a spiritual figurehead than a true ruler, while real authority lay with local emirs, or foreign dynasties like the Buyids, and later the Seljuks. Still, the city remained a cultural and intellectual hub, its libraries filled, its scholars active, its markets thriving. But the wheel of history turned again. In 1258 CE, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan descended upon Mesopotamia. Baghdad, weakened by internal strife and unable to resist the ferocity of Mongol armies, fell after a brutal siege. The sack of the city was catastrophic. Libraries burned, thousands were slaughtered, and the Tigris was said to run black with ink and red with blood. The city of peace, once the jewel of the world, lay in ruins. It was one of the greatest shocks in the history of civilization, a reminder that no city, however mighty, was immune to the tides of conquest. Though Baghdad would revive in later centuries, it never fully regained the centrality it had under the early Abbasids. Other cities rose. Cairo, under the Mamluks, Istanbul under the Ottomans, while Mesopotamia, Tom, under the Ottomans, while Mesopotamia became once again a province, contested by empires, rather than the seat of one. But the memory of Abbasid Baghdad endured, just as the memory of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon had before it. It remained a symbol of what Mesopotamia could achieve when rivers of knowledge, commerce, and culture converged in one place. The coming of Islam did not erase the legacy of earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. It reshaped it. The ziggurats crumbled, but their astronomical traditions lived on in observatories. Cuneiform was forgotten, but the concept of recording and codifying knowledge continued in Arabic manuscripts. The gods of Sumer and Babylon vanished from temples, but their myths echoed faintly in stories retold in new religious contexts. Mesopotamia's identity shifted, but its role as a crucible of civilization remained. From the mud-brick villages of Sumer to the palaces of Babylon, from the libraries of Ashurbanipal to the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the land between the rivers remained the stage on which humanity rehearsed its greatest experiments. Each era added a new layer. Each conquest reshaped its destiny. But the continuity of human striving endured. The coming of Islam and the birth of Baghdad was one of the most brilliant of those layers. Proof that even after millennia of rise and fall, Mesopotamia could still astonish the world. The enduring memory of Mesopotamia. The story of Mesopotamia does not end with the fall of Babylon to Cyrus, nor with the rise of Baghdad under the Abbasids, nor even with the Mongol sack that left its libraries smoldering. For a land that gave birth to cities, writing and empire cannot truly vanish. It endures in memory, in fragments of clay, in the languages we speak, in the laws we follow, in the rhythms of daily life that still echo practices first tested on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The land between two rivers has become less a geographic place and more an idea, a symbol of beginnings, of fragility, of the deep roots of civilization. For centuries after the Mongols rode through Baghdad, Mesopotamia became once again a frontier, a contested province under larger empires. The Ilkhanids ruled it as part of their dominion, later succeeded by the Timurids, the Safavids, and the Ottomans. Each empire recognized the fertility of the rivers, the wealth of the soil, the strategic importance of the crossroads, but none restored Mesopotamia to the centrality it had once commanded. Its fields still yielded grain, its canals were patched and repatched, its cities rebuilt, but the role of global capital shifted elsewhere. Cairo, Istanbul, Delhi, and later European cities became the centers of power. Mesopotamia remained vital but provincial, living in the shadow of its own past. Still, memory lingered. Medieval travelers like Ibn Battuta passed through the ruins of Babylon and wrote of their melancholy silence. Pilgrims came to visit shrines in Najaf and Karbala, weaving new layers of religious significance upon ancient ground. Local villagers still farmed in patterns unchanged for thousands of years, coaxing crops from soil irrigated by canals first dug in the age of Hammurabi. The ancient monuments decayed, but their outlines haunted the horizon. Ziggurats became mounds of brick and earth, their forms still rising faintly against the sky. The great arch of Ctesiphon, the Tak Kasra, stood like a solitary sentinel, a reminder of Persian grandeur and Mesopotamian endurance. In Europe, the memory of Mesopotamia survived in a different form. Through the Bible, Babylon became a symbol of pride and downfall, of exile and longing. To Christians, it was both the city of sin and the place where faith endured in adversity. To scholars of the Renaissance who rediscovered Greek texts infused with Babylonian astronomy, Mesopotamia appeared as a silent partner in the rebirth of science. In popular imagination, however, the ruins were more myth than reality. The Tower of Babel, Nebuchadnezzar's gardens, the writing on the wall, these were known, but the people who had built them were shadows, their voices lost. That silence was broken in the 19th century. As European empires expanded into the Middle East, archaeologists followed in their wake, spades in hand. In the mounds of Iraq, they uncovered clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped signs. At first, the markings were indecipherable, but slowly, through painstaking study, Cuneiform was cracked open. Scholars realized they were reading contracts, letters, hymns, and epics written thousands of years before Greece, before Rome, before even the Hebrew scriptures. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia astonished the modern world. What had been thought of as a biblical backdrop revealed itself as a civilization of astonishing depth. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from the dust, telling of a king who wrestled with mortality long before Homer sang of Achilles. The Code of Hammurabi stood revealed as one of humanity's earliest law codes. Astronomical tables, medical texts, and myths spoke with voices across millennia. These discoveries reshaped history. No longer was civilization understood as beginning in Greece or Egypt alone. The spades of Layard and Rawlinson showed that the roots reached deeper into the mud-brick temples of Sumer and Akkad. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin filled with reliefs of Assyrian kings, colossal winged bulls, and delicate cylinder seals. Clay tablets were carried across continents, studied by scholars who pieced together lost languages. Mesopotamia was reborn not as a living empire, but as an academic field, a source of wonder and humility for a modern age that prided itself on progress. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Mesopotamia's legacy became even more complicated. The land, now known as Iraq, was caught in wars and upheavals that scarred its people and threatened its heritage. Looters carried off treasures from museums. Bombs shook cities that had stood for thousands of years. Archaeological sites were damaged or neglected. The cradle of civilization once again became a battleground, and its ruins became both casualties of conflict and symbols of resilience. And yet, even in turmoil, Mesopotamia's memory persisted. Scholars continued to study tablets. Local communities continued to live among the ruins, their daily routines not so different from those of ancient farmers. The rivers still flowed, stubborn as time. The enduring memory of Mesopotamia lies in 3 dimensions. First, it is material. The clay tablets, the broken statues, the ruined ziggurats are tangible reminders that here, in this land, humans first dared to build something larger than themselves. Second, it is cultural. The ideas born here, Writing, law, astronomy, empire, seeped outward, carried by trade, conquest, and exile, until they became the foundations of global civilization. Third, it is symbolic. Mesopotamia has become a metaphor for origins and for fragility. It reminds us that every empire, however mighty, is vulnerable to collapse, that human achievement and human suffering are inseparable, that the past is always present in ways we do not immediately see. When we divide the circle into 360 degrees, we are echoing scribes who calculated angles on clay. When we tell time in hours of 60 minutes, in minutes of 60 seconds, we are repeating Mesopotamian choices. When we study law codes, we walk in Hammurabi's shadow. When we look at flood myths, at towers of ambition, at laments for fallen cities, we are listening to voices that spoke from and Uruk. And when we gather in cities, organize governments, record words, and debate justice, we are living the inheritance of a land between two rivers that has never truly ceased to shape us. The memory of Mesopotamia is also a memory of humanity itself. It shows us what we are capable of when we cooperate, and what we risk when we overreach. It tells us that civilization is fragile, that prosperity depends on balance with nature, that arrogance can undo kings as surely as foreign invasion. The soil of Mesopotamia, layered with ruins of countless cities, is testimony to the cycles of human history. To walk there is to step across centuries, each layer whispering a story of hope and ruin. Today, as satellites circle the globe, as digital tablets replace clay ones, as nations rise and fall with dizzying speed, the lessons of Mesopotamia remain. We are still building towers of ambition, still inscribing our laws, still measuring the stars, still dreaming of immortality. The rivers remind us that time flows, that civilizations may crumble, but their memory endures, that humanity is bound not only by blood and soil, but by the inheritance of those who came before. The story that began with farmers planting barley in the silt of the Euphrates, with herders watering flocks by the Tigris, has become the story of us all. From Sumer to Babylon, from Nineveh to Baghdad, from clay to silicon, the thread remains unbroken. Mesopotamia is not gone. It lives wherever humans build, write, count, and remember. Its memory is enduring, and in that endurance lies both a warning and a promise.